On a busy Saturday in October 1993, two IRA members disguised as delivery men entered Frizzle's fish shop on Shankill Road in West Belfast. They carried a bomb intended to target Loyalist leaders, believed to be meeting in an upstairs office within a tightly packed block of buildings. Unbeknownst to them, although this is doubted by some, the office was empty at the time. Despite knowing the densely populated area below would result in inevitable civilian casualties, the IRA pressed ahead without issuing any warning. The bomb detonated prematurely, unleashing devastation. 10 people were killed, including one of the IRA bombers, a UDA member, and 8 Protestant civilians, 2 of them children. Over 50 others were injured in the blast. One of the bombing's intended targets was Johnny Mad Dog Adair, the notorious Loyalist terror chief, who allegedly began plotting a response of mass murder in retaliation for the attack. Johnny Adair, born on October 27, 1963, grew up in the heart of Belfast's Protestant Loyalist community. Raised on the volatile Old Lodge Road, an area rife with clashes between Loyalist and Nationalist factions, Adair's early environment was steeped in tension and sectarian divides. Although his father, Jimmy Adair, steered clear of paramilitary involvement, young Adair carved his own path into the chaos, rising to become one of Northern Ireland's most infamous and feared Loyalist paramilitary leaders. As a teenager, Adair gravitated toward trouble, joining a gang of skinheads that thrived on a cocktail of petty crime and politically charged violence. This gang, dubbed the NF Skins, quickly developed a reputation for brutality, aligning themselves with the far-right National Front, a nationalist group in the UK. They made headlines by targeting anti-racist concertgoers in Belfast, cementing their notoriety. Adair himself founded a rock against communism band called Offensive Weapon, a stark reflection of his growing ideological fervour and penchant for confrontation. It wasn't long before Adair's youthful rebellion escalated into something far more dangerous. By the age of 19, he found himself at a crossroads after an altercation drew the attention of the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, a Loyalist paramilitary group which supported the continued existence of Northern Ireland, and formerly all of Ireland, within the United Kingdom, and opposed a United Ireland independent of the UK. Its declared goal was to defend Ulster Protestant Loyalist areas and to combat Irish republicanism, particularly the Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA. Given a grim ultimatum, accept a kneecapping or join their ranks, Adair chose the latter, becoming a member of the Ulster Young Militants, the UDA's youth wing. His early tasks focused on rioting and intimidation, but his relentless ambition and ruthless tactics soon set him apart. Adair's rapid rise through the ranks culminated in his transfer to the infamous C Company of the West Belfast Brigade. There, he began to hone his reputation as a relentless and violent operator, fully immersing himself in the bloody and sectarian conflicts that defined Northern Ireland's troubles. His journey from a rebellious teenager to a Loyalist commander was only beginning, with darker and more violent chapters yet to come. In 1993, Johnny Adair ascended to the role of Brigadier for the West Belfast Brigade, wasting no time in assembling what he called his dream team. This inner circle, made up of former skinhead allies turned hardened UDA operatives, transformed Belfast Shankill Road into a fortress of fear. The area became synonymous with ruthless violence, as Adair and his men unleashed a relentless campaign against suspected Republicans and often innocent Catholics, with shocking brutality. The early 1990s were a period of upheaval for the UDA. In 1987, John McMichael, a leading Northern Irish Loyalist and charismatic leader of the UDA's South Belfast Brigade, was killed by a bomb placed under his car just outside his Ilden Court home, days before his 40th birthday. At the time, he was en route to deliver Christmas turkeys to the families of Loyalist prisoners. At 8:20 p.m, after starting his car, he began reversing down a driveway when the movement-sensitive switch of the 5-pound, 2.3-kilo booby-trap bomb was triggered. The bomb exploded, causing McMichael to lose both legs and suffer severe internal injuries. He was rushed to Logan Valley Hospital, where he died shortly after. The Provisional IRA claimed responsibility for the attack. The following year, UDA Supreme Commander Andy Tyree resigned after a car bomb attempt on his life. The assassination of John McMichael and Tyree's resignation created a power vacuum. Adair stepped into this chaos, seizing control of the West Belfast Brigade, and steering it toward an era of unparalleled violence. Under his leadership, sectarian bloodshed became the order of the day, with civilians frequently caught in the crossfire. Adair's ferocity earned him a reputation as one of the most feared men in Northern Ireland. He openly declared his hatred for Catholics, boldly stating that anyone who wasn't Loyalist was a legitimate target. After Jim Spence, the previous brigadier, was imprisoned for extortion, Adair assumed his position without hesitation. By 1995, Adair made history, though infamously, as the first person in Northern Ireland to be charged with directing terrorism. During his trial, he brazenly admitted to leading the UDA for the 3 years leading up to 1994, solidifying his place as one of the most controversial and notorious figures of the Troubles. During his reign as brigadier, Johnny Adair and his inner circle orchestrated a campaign of terror that left an indelible stain on Northern Ireland's history. His unit, bolstered by a ruthless team led by Stevie Top Gun McKee, was responsible for a string of indiscriminate killings, targeting Catholic civilians with chilling precision. The Royal Ulster Constabulary later estimated that Adair's brigade had claimed up to 40 lives during this blood-soaked period. Adair's unapologetic hatred for Catholics was evident in his brazen remarks. In one chilling encounter, he told a Catholic journalist from the Republic of Ireland that Catholics typically rode on the trunk of his car, a sinister reference to his treatment of those he considered enemies. Reports from 2003 revealed that Adair had received intelligence on suspected Republicans from the British Army's Intelligence Corps, which even extended invitations for him to dine with them in the early 1990s. In his autobiography, Adair claimed that certain sympathetic soldiers provided him with valuable intelligence on Republican paramilitaries, while accusing the RUC Special Branch of betraying him by leaking his whereabouts to the IRA. As Brigadier of the West Belfast UDA, Adair held a powerful seat on the UDA in the council, a 6-member body that dictated the organisation's actions. His relentless appetite for violence often brought him into direct conflict with other Loyalist leaders, particularly Joe English, the South East Antrim Brigadier, who advocated for peace talks. The tensions between Adair's warpath and English's diplomatic leanings highlighted the deep divisions within the Loyalist movement. Adair's notoriety extended far beyond Belfast, with the BBC dubbing him the most controversial, high-profile and omnipresent paramilitary figure of his time, a man whose name became synonymous with terror, chaos and unrelenting conflict. In 1993, the IRA made a bold attempt on Johnny Adair's life in the infamous Shankill Road bombing. Their target was a fish shop with an office above, doubling as the UDA's Shankill headquarters, where a meeting was scheduled to take place. However, the plot went awry. The bomb detonated prematurely, killing one IRA operative, Thomas Begley, and 9 others, including a UDA member and 8 Protestant civilians. The UDA's retaliation was swift and merciless. The Grey Steel Massacre in Londonderry, carried out just a week after the Shankill bombing. In a chilling attack, gunmen stormed the Rising Sun bar and opened fire, killing 7 people. Another man later died from his injuries. Before unleashing the deadly assault, one of the gunmen shouted, "Trick or treat." Adair, no stranger to being a marked man, became the target of several assassination attempts, though he often inflated the number of plots against him to bolster his notoriety. In 1995, his reign of terror came to an abrupt halt. The RUC had meticulously compiled evidence from recorded conversations, finally pinning him with charges of directing terrorism. He was eventually convicted after undercover police tape recorded him boasting about his murderous exploits. Adair was handed a 16-year prison sentence and sent to the Maze prison, a fortress infamous for housing Northern Ireland's most hardened paramilitaries. Even behind bars, Adair's influence remained unshaken. From his prison cell, he reportedly orchestrated operations, including a lucrative drug trade that funneled substantial weekly profits from fellow inmates. Yet his time in prison wasn't solely defined by criminal enterprise. In 1998, he unexpectedly played a role in the peace process. Adair sat down with British Secretary of State Mo Mowlam, who managed to secure his reluctant support for the Good Friday Agreement, an historic milestone in Northern Ireland's quest for peace. In 1999, Johnny Adair walked free under the early release scheme tied to the Good Friday Agreement. His return to the streets of Belfast was anything but quiet. He wasted no time reasserting his influence and setting his sights on consolidating power within the UDA. What followed was another violent and chaotic chapter in Adair's life, beginning in 2000 as he plunged headfirst into deadly feuds with rival Loyalist factions. His aggression was no longer confined to Republican targets, but turned toward fellow Loyalists, particularly the UVF. Adair orchestrated a so-called Loyalist Day of Culture, which descended into violence and ignited a wave of bloody clashes between the UDA and UVF. The conflict grew so intense that many UVF members and their families were forced to flee the Shankill area, but the chaos didn't stop there. The feud spiraled into a broader internal struggle within the UDA, pitting Adair against other powerful brigadiers like John Gregg and Jim Gray. Gregg, a senior member of the UDA, emerged as one of Adair's fiercest opponents, with tensions escalating into open hostilities. However, Adair's reckless pursuit of control seemed to lead to his downfall. By 2002, his blatant ties to criminal enterprises, particularly drug trafficking, alienated many within the UDA, who believed his actions tarnished the organisation's purported ideals. In September of that year, the UDA's council made a decisive move, formally expelling him from the organisation. Adair, however, refused to bow out quietly. His defiance turned his West Belfast Brigade into a rogue faction, ostracised by the broader UDA. The fallout was swift. In early 2003, Adair's early release licence was revoked, landing him back in prison for his continued illegal activities. Seizing the opportunity, the UDA launched a final, crushing offensive against Adair's remaining Loyalists, wiping out their presence in Belfast. That same year, Adair's rival Greg was shot dead in a taxi near the Belfast docks. Adair was believed to have had a role in the killing and was put on a UDA death list, which made his son Jonathan and his mother flee to Bolton in the UK, while Adair was serving time in the Maghaberry prison. Early 2005, Adair was once again a free man after being airlifted by a helicopter out of Maghaberry to prevent reprisals. Forced into exile, he joined his partner in Bolton. There they lived in isolation, cut off from the Loyalist community they had once dominated, marking a dramatic fall from power for Northern Ireland's most infamous paramilitary leader. In exile, Adair's life remained turbulent, riddled with controversy and legal troubles. Resettled in England, he and his Loyalist supporters gravitated toward far-right groups like Combat 18, entrenching themselves further in criminality. Adair faced relentless accusations of orchestrating drug operations, while his son Jonathan, infamously nicknamed Mad Pup, became a fixture of police reports, arrested repeatedly for drug-related offences. Jonathan was caught stealing cars, joyriding, and even robbing the home of an 84-year-old woman. When a female shop assistant was assaulted at a filling station on Crumlin Road, his father came under pressure to rein in his son. Late one night in August 2002, 17-year-old Jonathan was shot in both calves with a 9mm pistol by gunmen from the UDA's infamous C Company. Shockingly, his father had ordered the shooting. 2 years later, Jonathan was sentenced to 5 years in prison for selling heroin and crack cocaine to undercover police on the streets of Bolton, Greater Manchester. By 2005, Adair and his partner had ended their relationship, and Adair had headed north to Troon, Scotland, along with a hardcore group of Loyalists. As soon as his son was released from his 5-year stretch, he joined his father. Despite his exile, Adair's shadow loomed large over Northern Ireland. Loyalist factions, still wary of his influence, continued to regard him as a dangerous figure. His notoriety made him a frequent target of rival paramilitary assassination plots. In 2006, Adair attempted to reshape his public image by publishing a ghostwritten autobiography, reportedly earning a substantial sum. In it, he sought to reframe his actions as politically motivated, distancing himself from the criminal enterprises that had stained his reputation. The violence that defined his life followed him into the 2000s and 2010s. Both Loyalist and Republican groups orchestrated assassination attempts, underscoring his polarising legacy. A particularly high-profile plot in 2015 by Irish Republicans aimed to eliminate Adair, but the conspiracy was foiled and 3 men were convicted. These persistent threats reflected the lasting scars of his violent career, ensuring Adair remained a target even in exile. A year after the botched hit, his son Jonathan, Mad Pup, who lived in the shadow of his father, was found dead in a house in Troon, Scotland. By then, the 32-year-old father of 2 had been in and out of prison for most of his adult life. He was released from Kilmarnock prison just a few days before his death, who was due to face new drugs charges. It's believed he overdosed. Adair's notoriety has been dissected in numerous documentaries, including a feature on Danny Dyer's Deadliest Men series, which also spotlighted his former associate Sam Skelly McCrory. His life stands as a grim symbol of Northern Ireland's tumultuous history, a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of sectarianism and violence on communities and individuals alike. On a seemingly ordinary Sunday evening in September 2010, drug dealer Sean Winters was relaxing in his Port Marnock apartment with friends when at about 10 p.m. his mobile phone rang. After a brief conversation, Winters casually told his friends he'd be stepping out for a few minutes to meet someone. But what followed was anything but casual. According to neighbours, a heated argument soon erupted outside. In the blink of an eye, Winters' body collapsed on the pavement. He'd been shot twice in the back of the head. The gunman, dressed in a dark jacket with the hood pulled up, swiftly jumped into the front seat of a silver Volkswagen Passat, speeding off into the night. Half an hour later, the car was found torched in Courtney. Winters was pronounced dead at the scene. Within hours of this cold-blooded execution, 6 suspects were arrested in a house in Donaghmede, and 4 others were detained after Gardaí intercepted a suspicious car. All were questioned, but later released without charge. Among the suspects was none other than real IRA leader Alan Ryan. In the heart of Dublin, where the shadows of mystery loom large and the echoes of conflict still resonate, 2 brothers emerged as figures of both fear and fascination. Alan Vincent Ryan, born into a staunchly Republican family, left an indelible mark on Ireland's criminal landscape. Their lives embodying the often blurred line between idealism and violence. Born in North Dublin during the twilight years of the Troubles, Alan and Vincent Ryan were raised in an environment steeped in Republican ideology. From an early age, they were immersed in stories of resistance against British rule and the ongoing struggle for a united Ireland. But as they came of age, the world around them was changing. The Provisional IRA had laid down arms, and the Good Friday Agreement promised a new era of peace. For many, it was a time of hope and reconciliation. For others, like the Ryans, it was a call to arms. Alan Ryan, the older of the 2, was quick to answer that call. By his late teens, he'd already joined the Fianna Éireann, the youth wing of the Republican movement. It was here that Alan began to shape his identity as a hardline Republican, one who saw the peace process not as progress, but as a betrayal of the cause. A former IRA member, speaking anonymously, reflected on those turbulent times, suggesting that the peace process had created a vacuum which dissidents and diehards quickly tried to fill. It was an opportunity that Alan Ryan seized with both hands. He first came to the attention of the Irish police in 1999, when authorities uncovered a real IRA weapons training camp in an underground bunker in County Meath. Alan was one of 10 people arrested in the raid. 6 months later, he pleaded guilty to receiving training in the use of firearms at the camp and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Alan was just 19 years old at the time. After his release from prison, Alan became heavily involved in extorting and threatening drug dealers. By the mid-2000s, he climbed the ranks of the dissident Republican movement, establishing himself as a key figure in what became known as the real IRA. He forged strong connections with dissident activists in the Northwest and maintained close ties between his Dublin-based gang and the leadership of the Derry faction. This relationship strengthened, particularly after a major conflict with the real IRA's commander in Dublin, during which Ryan reportedly used his muscle to support the Derry group's operations. Alan's vision of Republican struggle was far removed from the political maneuverings of Sinn Féin or the armed campaigns of the past. Instead, he saw a new battlefield in the streets of Dublin, one where control of the criminal underworld was the prize. His modus operandi was as simple as it was brutal. He and his group would extort money from drug gangs and businessmen across the city and demand protection money from firms. His faction would soon get involved in feuds with major gangland criminals, and his group is thought to have been responsible for at least 3 murders in Dublin and many more violent acts. They targeted drug dealers operating in North Dublin, demanding protection money and using violence to enforce their will. To Alan, this was not mere criminality, but a continuation of the Republican struggle by other means. He saw himself as a Robin Hood figure, extorting from the criminal elements to fund the cause. But the reality was far from heroic. Alan's reign of terror left a trail of broken bodies and shattered lives. One particularly gruesome incident saw a well-known drug dealer have his fingers chopped off in a park in Drumcondra, a brutal message to those who would defy the Rio IRA's demands. As Alan's power grew, so did his public profile. Unlike the secretive IRA members of the past, Alan and his crew embraced a flashy, ostentatious lifestyle. The Players' Lounge, a local pub in Fairview owned by the father of soccer star Anthony Stokes, became their de facto headquarters. A place where young women flocked and the beer flowed freely, even if Alan himself was known to abstain. In July 2010, the pub turned into a scene of horror when notorious gun-for-hire John Wilson opened fire and shot 3 men. Wilson was sent by veteran criminal Sean Hunt, an ex-IRA chief who had amassed millions through various illegal activities, including smuggling cigarettes. Hunt clashed with Alan when he'd begun extorting protection money from him. However, John Wilson messed up, and instead of killing the target, he nearly killed 3 innocent men. Meanwhile, the flashy lifestyle Alan and his crew displayed was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it attracted a new generation of young men to the cause, drawn to the promise of power, money, and a sense of belonging. On the other, it made Alan and his associates easy targets for both law enforcement and rival gangs. In the meantime, Vincent Ryan, known as Vinny, was following in his brother's footsteps. Younger and perhaps more impressionable, Vinny idolized Alan and soon found himself deeply embedded in the Rio IRA's activities. Where Alan was the strategist and leader, Vinny was the soldier, the enforcer. The brothers' rise to power did not go unchallenged. Their extortion racket brought them into direct conflict with established criminal gangs, most notably the increasingly powerful Kinahan cartel. The streets of Dublin became a battleground, with tit-for-tat killings and assassination attempts becoming all too common. The brothers are believed to have targeted convicted drug dealer Eamon Kelly and Brian O'Reilly, both close rivals of the notorious fingerless gang leader Eamon Adon Dunn, who was shot dead in April 2010 after his own people turned against him. Both men, who were told to pay up or be attacked, survived. However, one of the most high-profile incidents occurred in September 2011, a year after the first murder Ryan's group is thought to have been responsible for, that of Sean Winters. In September 2011, Michael the Panda Kelly was gunned down in broad daylight on Marsfield Avenue in Clongriffin. Kelly, also known as Mika, a well-known drug dealer, had reportedly refused to pay protection money to the Ryan brothers. His murder was a statement of intent from the Rio IRA: pay up or face the consequences. The killing of Kelly would prove to be a turning point. It brought increased police scrutiny and, more dangerously, marked the Ryan brothers as targets for some of Dublin's most dangerous criminals. The response came swiftly and brutally. On a Monday afternoon in September 2012, Alan Ryan was on his way to visit some family at a house in the area close to his own. As he was walking along Grange Lodge Avenue with 2 friends, a gunman pulled up behind him. After shooting Alan in the back and legs with a 9mm handgun, the gunman stepped up to Alan's body on the ground and shot him in the head. Alan Ryan died instantly, his life ending on the very streets he had sought to control. The gunman then shot one of the others in the leg before escaping in a silver Volvo car, which was later found burnt out in a nearby graveyard. Within hours of his murder, the Derry branch of the 32 County Sovereignty Movement, which is seen as the political wing of the Rio IRA, paid tribute to Ryan on a website. Alan's funeral was a spectacle that shocked the nation. Hundreds of mourners, many dressed in paramilitary uniform, escorted his coffin through the streets of Dublin. The men's attire included green military-style jumpers and combat trousers, along with scarves covering their faces, dark sunglasses, and black berets. A volley of shots was fired over the coffin, a traditional Republican salute that seemed jarringly out of place in 21st century Ireland. The show of strength was both a final tribute to Alan and a warning to his enemies. The Rio IRA was not finished. At the time of his death, Alan was facing a charge of demanding money with menaces from a Dublin publican. Gardaí were worried about the fact that Republican groups don't tend to forget when members of their organisation have been shot and killed, particularly by drug gangs or violent gangland criminals. In February 2013, 2 individuals suspected of involvement in Alan's murder were arrested when police stopped their car in Enniskillen. The suspects were Pascal Kelly and Jonathan Gill, also known as Mr. Big. During a search of an apartment at Porter Wharf, of which they held the keys, authorities discovered €65,826 and £2,669 in cash, along with 24 mobile phones. Interestingly, the same apartment complex housed 3 PSNI officers, triggering a significant security concern. Among the items seized was a passport with Kelly's photograph, but under the name Brendan Duffy, the alias he had given during his arrest. When questioned, both suspects responded with no comment. Although their bail was initially denied, they were never formally charged with the murder of Alan. For Vinnie Ryan, his brother's death was both a personal tragedy and a call to arms. He stepped up to fill the void left by Alan, determined to continue the fight. But the landscape had shifted. The Rio IRA, already a fractured organisation, was further weakened by internal power struggles and the increasing pressure from both law enforcement and rival gangs. Vinnie found himself caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse. He was arrested and charged in connection with firearms offences related to the murder of Michael Kelly, though he was eventually acquitted due to issues with DNA evidence. But the acquittal did little to ease the pressure on him. The next few years were a blur of violence and retribution. The Rio IRA, under Vinnie's leadership, continued to clash with drug gangs and carry out acts of violence, only that they were fighting a losing battle. The old alliances were crumbling, and the protection once offered by their Republican credentials was wearing thin. In February 2016, the simmering tensions in Dublin's Underworld exploded into all-out war, the notorious Kinahan-Hutch feud. The Regency Hotel attack, a brazen assault carried out by a Hutch-aligned gunman disguised as Garda officers, left Kinahan associate David Byrne dead and sent shockwaves through the criminal landscape. While not directly involved, Vinnie Ryan's name was whispered in connection with the attack, further painting a target on his back. Just weeks later, on February 29, 2016, Vinnie Ryan's luck ran out. At 3:15 p.m, he was sitting alone in his white Volkswagen Golf outside his partner's home in Finglas. He had just dropped off his partner Kelly and their 5-week-old daughter when a silver 5-door Volkswagen Golf with alloy wheels pulled up alongside and discharged a number of shots into the vehicle. In a meticulously planned attack, at least 13 shots were fired, one of which struck Vinnie in the head. He later died in the hospital. The getaway car was found burnt out. It was the second time in a few months that Vinnie had been targeted. In October the previous year, he suffered serious but non-life-threatening facial injuries after being approached by a man with a knife. The murder of Vinnie Ryan marked the end of an era. The Rio IRA, once a feared force on Dublin's streets, was now a shadow of his former self. The Ryan brothers, who had lived by the sword, had ultimately died by it. But the story doesn't end there. The aftermath of the Ryan brothers' reign of terror continues to reverberate through Dublin's criminal world. Their deaths left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by other criminal elements, leading to further violence and instability. The investigation into Vinnie Ryan's murder would uncover a complex web of criminal connections. 2 men, Paul O'Byrne and Jeffrey Morrow, would eventually be convicted for their roles in facilitating the murder, having provided and then destroyed the stolen Volkswagen Golf used in the shooting. The trial of O'Byrne and Morrow shed light on the intricate planning that went into Vinnie's assassination. The stolen Volkswagen Golf, meticulously tracked through CCTV footage and forensic analysis, became a crucial piece of evidence. The car's destruction was intended to erase any trace of the perpetrators, yet the evidence left behind was enough to lead authorities to those responsible. In the years following the Ryan brothers' deaths, the criminal landscape of Dublin continued to evolve. The power vacuum left by their demise was quickly filled by other players, most notably the ascendant Kinahan cartel. The ongoing feud between the Kinahan and Hutch gangs would eclipse the violence of the Ryan era, bringing unprecedented levels of bloodshed to the streets of Dublin. One figure who emerged as a key player in this new era was the enigmatic criminal Jonathan Gill, known only as Mr. Big. Believed to have been involved in Alan Ryan's murder, his influence grew in the aftermath of the Ryan brothers' deaths. Gill's ability to navigate the complex alliances and enmities of Dublin's underworld made him a formidable force. Sources close to the investigation revealed that he had cultivated connections with both the Kinahan cartel and other criminal groups. His opportunistic approach to alliances allowed him to thrive in the chaos that followed the Ryan brothers' demise. The rise of figures like Mr. Big highlighted the shifting nature of organised crime in Ireland. The old structures, based on paramilitary organisations and rigid hierarchies, were giving way to more fluid, opportunistic criminal networks. This new landscape proved challenging for law enforcement, requiring new strategies and approaches. Recently, a number of online tributes have been posted to commemorate the 12th anniversary of Alan Ryan's death. The killing of the Rio IRA leader in September 2012 has been described as arguably the most significant gangland killing in the past decade. On the afternoon of March 16, 1988, Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast was already charged with tension long before the first explosion. 3 coffins lay ready for burial. Inside them were the bodies of IRA volunteers shot dead by the SAS in Gibraltar just days earlier. Their deaths had ignited fury across nationalist communities, and the funerals were expected to draw thousands. Television crews were present. Police and soldiers hovered on the edges. Everyone knew the atmosphere was volatile. But no one expected what would happen next. This was not a riot, not a clash between rival groups, not a spontaneous eruption of violence. What unfolded at Milltown was something colder, rarer, and far more disturbing. It was a one-man attack carried out in broad daylight against unarmed civilians, and it would become one of the most infamous atrocities of the Troubles. In the long and bloody history of Northern Ireland's Troubles, few figures have become as infamous or as deeply divisive as Michael Stone, a man whose name is inseparable from some of the conflict's most shocking and public acts of violence. Stone was not a politician, nor a commander in the traditional sense. He was something darker, a loyalist militant whose actions did not remain hidden in backstreets or whispered about in the shadows, but unfolded before cameras, crowds, and history itself. His life, marked by brutality, imprisonment, and repeated attempts at reinvention, has become synonymous with the violent methods loyalist paramilitaries used in their fight to preserve Northern Ireland's union with Britain. To understand Michael Stone is to understand how the Troubles could erupt anywhere, even at a funeral, and how the deep sectarian divides of the conflict could shape an individual's destiny, leaving behind legacies of bitterness, violence, and unhealed wounds that continue to polarize opinion to this day. Michael Stone's story begins far from the streets where his name would later become notorious. He was born in Birmingham in the spring of 1955, but his earliest years were defined less by family warmth than by disruption. Almost immediately, his home life fell apart. His father Alfred spent long stretches away at sea serving in the merchant navy, and his mother Mary left while he was still very young, leaving Michael effectively without parents in any meaningful sense. He was soon sent to Northern Ireland to be raised by relatives in Ballyhalbert, a move that would quietly shape the course of his life. In the Gregg household, Protestant loyalism was not simply a political outlook, it was part of everyday identity. Yet Stone's background carried a complexity that never fully disappeared. His mother's Catholic roots placed him uncomfortably between two traditions in a society where such divisions mattered deeply. Even as a child, he was growing up with a sense of contradiction, caught between worlds that were increasingly hostile to one another. When the family later relocated to the brand new housing estate in East Belfast, Stone entered a city where tension was beginning to boil over. The late 1960s brought unrest that would soon erupt into decades of violence, and the atmosphere around him grew harsher with each passing year. At school, Stone struggled to settle into ordinary life. He clashed with authority, became known for fighting, and showed little interest in education. By his mid-teens, he was expelled from Lisnashara Secondary School for repeated violence, leaving him adrift at exactly the moment Belfast streets were becoming shaped by anger, sectarian identity, and conflict. And with no clear future ahead of him, Stone began to gravitate toward the only world that seemed to offer belonging. On the brand new estate, he fell in with a local gang known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, a rough circle of young men drawn together by boredom, anger, and the growing atmosphere of unrest. At first, religion was not the defining line. Catholics and Protestants mixed freely, but Northern Ireland was changing fast. As sectarian tensions hardened across Belfast, even teenage gangs began to split along the same fault lines, tearing the country apart. Stone chose his side, aligning himself fully with the Loyalist cause, and that choice would prove irreversible. By 1971, he had moved into the orbit of the tartan gangs, informal but increasingly violent Protestant groups who carried out intimidation, vandalism, and attacks on Catholic neighbourhoods. These were not yet disciplined paramilitary units, but they were a training ground, a gateway into something darker. For young men like Stone, they offered purpose, the belief that violence could be justified as defence, that identity could be protected through force. It wasn't long before Stone's aggression drew the attention of powerful figures within Loyalism. Tommy Heron, a key leader in the Ulster Defence Association, saw potential in him and brought him into the UDA in 1972. From that moment, Stone was no longer just a volatile teenager. He was entering a world of organised sectarian warfare. Initiation was brutal, designed to strip away hesitation and prove loyalty through cruelty. Stone complied, and in doing so, cemented his place within the organisation. His early work focused on intimidation, extortion, and street-level control, the criminal machinery that kept Loyalist power rooted in working-class estates. But these were only the first steps. Each act pulled him deeper into a paramilitary underworld, where crime and ideology blurred together, and where violence was no longer random, but purposeful. But the deeper Stone sank into Loyalist paramilitarism, the clearer it became that violence was no longer something on the edges of his life. It was becoming the centre of it. In the early years, his role was not yet defined by headline-making attacks, but by the murky overlap of crime and conflict that dominated the streets of Belfast. One of the first signs of where he was heading came when he was arrested attempting to steal firearms from a sporting goods shop, a small incident on paper, but one that revealed a darker truth. In the Troubles, criminality and paramilitary warfare were often inseparable, feeding off one another in the shadows. Then, in 1973, the assassination of Tommy Heron sent shockwaves through the Loyalist world. The UDA's Braniel unit began to fracture, loyalty splintered, and Stone was left drifting in the aftermath, increasingly disillusioned, restless, and searching for direction. He questioned the leadership, the lack of strategy, the sense that the organisation was losing focus. But for Stone, uncertainty did not lead to retreat. It pushed him towards something harder, something more extreme. In 1974, he stepped further into the darkness by joining the Red Hand Commando, a smaller, tighter, more militant organisation known for secrecy and ruthless efficiency. Unlike the sprawling UDA, the RHC operated almost invisibly, moving behind the scenes, supporting Loyalist power brokers while carrying out covert operations against Republican targets and Catholic communities. Stone took on roles that brought him close to prominent Loyalist figures, including William Craig, a leading voice of hardline unionism. And it was during this period that Stone later began telling stories that hinted at an even wider world, claiming contact with Mossad, suggesting foreign intelligence agencies viewed the IRA as part of an international terrorist threat. The claims were never substantiated, but they revealed something important. Stone was beginning to see himself not as a street-level thug, but as a soldier in a much larger war. Still, even the Red Hand Commando was not enough. Stone grew frustrated with what he perceived as inactivity, impatience building inside him like pressure in a sealed chamber. By the mid-1980s, he returned to the UDA, and this time it marked the beginning of his most violent and infamous transformation. He was no longer a recruit, no longer a petty enforcer. Stone became part of a specialised unit tasked with eliminating Republican figures, and the violence quickly turned deadly. In November 1984, he carried out his first confirmed killing, shooting Patrick Brady, a Catholic milkman he claimed to suspect of IRA involvement. No evidence ever emerged to support the accusation, but the truth scarcely mattered anymore. The killing was a beginning, not an end. What followed was a brutal campaign of targeted assassinations. Stone became known for meticulous planning, disguises, and an unnerving willingness to kill without hesitation. His name began to spread across Belfast, feared, whispered, infamous. To some Loyalists, he was a defender striking back in a dirty war. To others, he was reckless, dangerous, leaving devastation in his wake. But in Stone's own mind, these were not simply political acts. They were personal missions, and with every attack, he moved further beyond the point of no return. And then came the moment that would cement Michael Stone's name in the darkest history of the Troubles, the day his violence erupted in full view of the world. On March 16, 1988, thousands of mourners gathered at Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast for the funeral of 3 IRA members killed in Gibraltar by the SAS. The atmosphere was already explosive, grief, anger, and political symbolism colliding in one place. Men, women, and children stood shoulder to shoulder along narrow paths between gravestones while prayers were spoken and coffins were lowered into the earth. The crowd was emotional but orderly. Police kept their distance, the British Army remained mostly out of sight, and television cameras quietly rolled, capturing what seemed for the moment like an emotional but orderly farewell. But at the edge of the cemetery, Stone entered heavily armed with a single intention: to kill. He did not wear a mask, he did not sprint or shout. He simply blended in, another figure among the crowd, grenades hidden in his pockets and a semi-automatic pistol pressed close to his body. There was no escape car, no accomplice waiting, no plan beyond what he was about to unleash. Then, without warning, he broke into a run, reached into his jacket, and threw. The grenade landed among mourners and detonated, ripping apart the silence in an instant. Screams erupted, bodies collapsed, people dove behind gravestones that offered almost no protection, and the cemetery, a place meant for mourning, became a battlefield. Stone's attack killed 3 people and injured many more. The images were broadcast worldwide. A lone gunman running through the graves as enraged mourners chased him down, beating and disarming him before police finally arrested him. The images of the assault were broadcast worldwide. A lone gunman running among gravestones as crowds chased him down. It was one of the most surreal and horrifying spectacles of the Troubles. The Milltown attack shocked Loyalists and Republicans alike. To some it was heroic, to many others reckless and disastrous, but for countless observers it represented something even more haunting. The moment sectarian violence descended to its most extreme and public form, proving that in the Troubles, not even the dead could be laid to rest in peace. The Milltown Cemetery attack did not happen in isolation. It triggered a chain reaction. Just 3 days later, Belfast gathered again, this time for the funeral of one of Stone's victims, Kevin Brady. The streets were packed with mourners, but the atmosphere was no longer merely sorrowful. It was tense, combustible, heavy with the expectation that something could happen at any moment. In the wake of Milltown, funerals had become flashpoints, places where grief and retaliation sat side by side. Then, in a moment of fatal misjudgment, 2 British Army corporals, Derek Wood and David Howes, drove into the crowd procession in plain clothes. Accounts suggest they may have become disoriented or taken a wrong turn. But in that charged environment, their presence was instantly interpreted as something far more sinister: surveillance, provocation, or even an attempted repeat of Milltown. The crowd reacted immediately. The car was surrounded. Men smashed the windows. The corporals were dragged from the vehicle as panic and fury erupted. What happened next unfolded in front of onlookers and cameras in one of the most horrifying spectacles of the Troubles. The 2 soldiers were beaten and forced into another vehicle, taken away under IRA control. Later, they were executed. Their deaths were filmed and photographed, images that would become some of the most infamous of the entire conflict. In less than a week, Belfast had witnessed an almost unimaginable descent. A funeral attacked with grenades, followed by another funeral turning into an execution scene. Stone's actions helped ignite one of the darkest spirals of escalation in late Troubles-era violence. In 1989, Michael Stone was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case seemed closed, another paramilitary murderer locked away, another chapter sealed, but Stone would not disappear into the prison system quietly. Stone served much of his sentence in the Maze prison, where paramilitary inmates often remained deeply political and influential. The prison itself was a microcosm of the conflict outside, Republican and Loyalist prisoners separated, organised, and still engaged in ideological struggle. Stone became a well-known figure behind bars, his name carrying weight far beyond the walls. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement brought a fragile peace, and with it, early releases for many paramilitary prisoners. After serving 13 years in prison, Michael Stone was released in 2000. For victims' families, this was deeply painful. A man responsible for a massacre walking free under political compromise. But Northern Ireland was changing, and the peace process demanded uncomfortable concessions. But Stone's story was far from finished. His attempts at reinvention proved brutally short-lived, and in 2006, he once again stunned Northern Ireland with a chilling reminder that the past was never truly gone. During a tense period of political transition, Stone arrived at Stormont, the seat of the devolved government, not as an artist or writer, but armed and dangerous. Carrying homemade explosives and knives, he attempted to breach the Parliament buildings, reportedly targeting senior Sinn Féin leaders Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. Security forces intervened before an attack could unfold, and Stone was arrested on the spot. He later dismissed the incident as performance art, but the courts rejected the claim entirely. Convicted once again, he was sentenced to a further 16 years in prison, a grim confirmation for many that even years after the peace agreement, the violent impulses and lingering ghosts of the Troubles had never fully disappeared. That was it for today's video. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see our next videos. On the evening of March 14, 1984, Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams was driving through the Falls Road in West Belfast, a heartland of Republican support, when everything changed in an instant. Without warning, gunfire erupted. The car carrying Adams was suddenly engulfed in a swarm of automatic weapon fire. Bullets tore through the vehicle in a carefully planned ambush. The attackers, members of the Ulster Defence Association, had been lying in wait. This was no random act of violence. It was precise, deliberate, and meant to kill. Inside the car, chaos. Adams was struck multiple times, hitting the neck, shoulder, and arm. Others travelling with him were also wounded as the gunmen unleashed round after round. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed certain the attack would claim his life. Loyalist John Gregg had a reputation few would challenge. A senior figure in the Ulster Defence Association, he commanded the South East Antrim Brigade, controlling its streets with force. A hardliner, a hawk, no compromise, and that made him a target. His support for expelling Johnny Mad Dog Adair put him in the crosshairs of C Company, the UDA's most feared section. The attempts followed, because in that world, power didn't protect you, it marked you. Gregg was born in 1957, raised in Tigers Bay, North Belfast, a hard, crowded Protestant enclave where tension wasn't occasional, it was constant. He grew up in violence. The late 60s and early 70s turned his streets into front lines. Bombings, shootings, riots. Not distant, not abstract, right outside his door. Streets became battlegrounds. Neighbours became targets, and a siege mentality took hold. In Tigers Bay, identity meant defence. Each clash hardened it. Survival and loyalty became the same thing. There was no middle ground. Gregg left school early, like many of his generation, stepping into a collapsing economy, shipyards fading, factories closing, jobs gone. What remained was pressure, frustration, isolation, a sense that everything was shifting against them. And under that weight, vigilantism didn't feel like a choice. It felt inevitable. Years later, he built a family life. married, a father, living near Carrickfergus. On the surface, it was distance from the violence, but there was no real escape. In the early 1970s, Northern Ireland was sliding into darkness. The Provisional Irish Republican Army escalated its campaign, bombings, shootings, relentless violence. By decade's end, over 1,000 were dead. Among them, Protestant civilians killed in attacks that felt to many both indiscriminate and personal. Fear didn't pass. It settled. In Unionist areas, security collapsed. Each blast, each killing stripped away any sense of safety. What was unfolding didn't feel political. It felt existential. And in that climate, retaliation didn't feel extreme. It felt necessary. In East Antrim, the pressure was constant. Killings, intimidation, disruption. Communities tightened, hardened, lines deepened. For many young Protestants, taking up arms wasn't radical, it was survival. Gregg was coming of age in that world. In Carrickfergus, he saw the fallout up close. Families driven out, homes abandoned, streets shifting overnight. Those images stayed. Neighbours gone, stories passed quietly, tension in every street. For Gregg, this wasn't politics, it was personal. The IRA, in his eyes, weren't liberators. They were advancing through violence, and that belief hardened into something fixed. Violence came first. Resistance followed. No ceasefire would change that. John Gregg was just 14 years old when he joined the Ulster Defence Association. 14, already stepping into a war. The early 1970s were spiralling. The Provisional Irish Republican Army had intensified its campaign. Bombings, shootings, assassinations. Protestant areas felt under constant threat. In 1971 alone, over 100 people were killed. Fear wasn't distant, it was everywhere. The UDA had just formed, presenting itself as a shield for Loyalist communities. Patrols, checkpoints, surveillance. Control of the streets became everything, and boys became soldiers. Gregg didn't hesitate. Like many of his generation, he'd grown up surrounded by violence. Later, he would say he joined to stop the IRA from doing what they wanted. To him, it wasn't extremism. It was necessary. He started in the Ulster Young Militants, the UDA's youth wing, learning the basics: watch, report, control. No glory, just vigilance. Eyes on every street, every stranger, every movement. In places like Carrickfergus and across southeast Antrim, the UDA tightened its grip, tracking threats, guarding estates, holding the line as families were driven from mixed areas. For Gregg, there was no transition, no turning point, just a single step from boyhood into conflict. By the early 1980s, John Gregg was no longer on the fringes. He was active, committed, and moving deeper into violence. Operating under the cover name of the Ulster Freedom Fighters, the Ulster Defence Association carried out shootings and bombings aimed at anyone linked, directly or indirectly, to Irish republicanism. It was retaliation, but it was also strategy. Strike hard, strike first, send a message. And Gregg was part of it. Then came March 14, 1984, a moment that would define him. That evening, Gregg and fellow UDA member Gerard Welsh drove into West Belfast with a single objective: kill Gerry Adams. By then, Adams was a leading figure in Sinn Féin and widely seen, especially by Loyalists, as closely tied to the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Whether officially acknowledged or not, many believed he was part of the IRA's leadership structure. To Loyalists like Gregg, that made him a legitimate target. Gregg and Welsh found their chance on the Andersontown Road. Adams' car slowed at traffic lights, and then gunfire. Around 20 rounds were unleashed in seconds. The windscreen shattered. Bullets tore through metal and glass. Adams was hit 3 times, neck, shoulder, his body collapsing under the impact. Inside the car, panic. Outside, chaos. But he didn't die. Against all odds, Adams survived. For Gregg, it didn't matter. In Loyalist circles, the damage was done. The message had landed. He had taken a shot at one of the most powerful figures in republicanism and lived to tell the story. That alone made him something else, not just a gunman, a name. The attack, claimed by the UFF, echoed far beyond Belfast. To some within Loyalism, Gregg became a hero, a man who had struck at the very top of the Republican movement during a time when the IRA's influence was surging in the wake of the 1981 hunger strikes. To others, it was something darker, a sign of just how far the conflict had gone, where political leaders were hunted in the streets and violence had become the language of power. For Gregg, there was no turning back after that. He hadn't just pulled the trigger, he had stepped fully into the war. The attack on Gerry Adams didn't just elevate John Gregg, it sealed his fate. Soon after the ambush, Gregg was arrested. The state moved fast. This wasn't a street gunman. This was a man who had nearly killed one of Republicanism's most prominent figures. In 1985, he was convicted, conspiracy to murder, firearms offences, 18 years. He was sent to Longkesh, the maze, not just a prison, a battleground. Inside the Loyalist wings, nothing stopped. It hardened. Planning, loyalty, reputation. Prison didn't break him, it built him. Gregg didn't waver. In one interview, he said his only regret about the attack was not finishing it. No remorse, only unfinished business. In October 1993, he walked free, released early under the Good Friday Agreement, part of a shifting political landscape hinting at peace. But on the ground, nothing had changed. The tension was still there. So was the war. Gregg didn't return quietly. He took control. Within a short time, he was Brigadier of the Ulster Defence Association's South East Antrim Brigade. Rath Cool, Carrickfergus, territory locked down. This was his ground. Discipline was absolute. No fragmentation, no weakness. And the Provisional Irish Republican Army, in his eyes, hadn't gone anywhere. So he prepared, strengthened networks, reinforced control, stayed ready. Under John Gregg, the South East Antrim Brigade became a fortress. From the mid-1990s, he ran it with near total autonomy inside the Ulster Defence Association. Carrickfergus was his base, but his control stretched across Larne, Ballymena, Rathcoole, an entire region under one command. Tight, controlled, unchallenged. Local units handled the streets, enforcement, surveillance, response. But everything flowed upward. Gregg didn't rely on Belfast. He was Belfast. The brigade sustained itself. Weapons moved through smuggling routes. Stockpiles grew. When violence stirred elsewhere, Gregg prepared before it arrived. He stayed ahead. Operations ran under the Ulster Freedom Fighters' name. Violence at arm's length. Clean and compartmentalised. Training was quiet, practical, built for one thing. Hold the ground. And it held. In East Antrim, Republican activity barely took root. Where Belfast burned, Gregg's territory stayed locked down. No foothold, no momentum. Because nothing moved unnoticed. Patrols, checkpoints, informants, pressure everywhere. Under Gregg, the message was clear. This ground wasn't contested, it was controlled. Under John Gregg, violence was never random. It was calculated, justified, framed as survival. By the mid-1990s, Loyalist areas believed the Provisional Irish Republican Army hadn't stopped, only changed. For Gregg, that meant one thing: act first. The South East Antrim Brigade of the Ulster Defence Association targeted those it claimed were tied to Republican activity. Every attack was labelled deterrence. January 12, 2002. Daniel McColgan, a 20-year-old Catholic postman, shot dead outside his workplace. Claimed, defended. Gregg called him a legitimate target. No hesitation. In April 1997, months after his release, his brigade broke the ceasefire, opening fire on a Catholic-owned pub in Antrim. Preemptive, he claimed. Necessary. July 2002, 17-year-old Gerard Lawler shot dead. Same pattern, same justification. Neutralise the threat. Stop what's coming next. Ceasefires meant nothing to Gregg without proof. So the violence didn't stop. It tightened. Targets were named, reasons given, but the line blurred again and again. And once that line is gone, everything becomes a target. By 2002, the war inside Loyalism had become just as dangerous as the one outside it. On one side was John Gregg, disciplined, territorial, focused on control. On the other was Johnny Adair, volatile, ambitious, and increasingly unpredictable. Same organisation, different vision. Adair was a high-profile UDA figure from West Belfast, leader of the notorious C Company. He built his reputation on aggression, feared on the streets, but also known for drawing attention. By the early 2000s, his faction had drifted away from traditional paramilitary structure and deeper into criminality, drug dealing, extortion, and violent feuds. And that's where the conflict began. For Gregg and other UDA leaders, Adair had become a liability. Adair came out of prison and pushed hard alliances with the Loyalist volunteer force, rogue attacks, open defiance. C Company was no longer controlled. To Gregg, it wasn't loyalty, it was betrayal. On the inner council, he drew the line. Discipline was collapsing, drugs, extortion, chaos. Adair's men were tearing through their own communities, rot from within. In September 2002, the Ulster Defence Association made its move. Inside an East Belfast meeting, 5 senior figures reached a decision. Johnny Adair was out, expelled, along with his ally John Wright. The reason was clear. Adair had crossed the line, aligning with the rival Loyalist volunteer force during an active feud. For Gregg and others, that wasn't strategy. Gregg backed the decision without hesitation. To him, Adair had abandoned discipline, trading loyalty for power, and turning the organisation inward. But the expulsion didn't restore order, it triggered war. C Company refused to stand down. Adair's men rejected the ruling outright and began mobilising. Within days, the streets shifted. Threats became shootings, warnings became killings. By early 2003, multiple murders had been tied to the feud. Loyalists targeting loyalists, across the Shankill, East Belfast and beyond. Gregg's brigade responded in kind. Lines were drawn, messages sent, stand down or be removed. Adair's faction hit back, striking rivals, pushing the conflict further. What had started as a leadership dispute became something else, a fracture. One side clinging to control, discipline, structure, the other driven by defiance, profit, and survival. As the violence spread, one thing became clear. The greatest threat to the UDA was no longer outside it. The split inside the Ulster Defence Association didn't cool, it escalated. And by early 2003, John Gregg knew exactly where it was heading. He'd already seen the signs, threats, retaliation, the tightening circle. Days before it happened, he admitted it to a friend. He believed he was going to be killed. On February 1st, 2003, that fear caught up with him. Gregg had just returned from Scotland after attending a Rangers match. Back in Belfast, he climbed into a red taxi near the docks, alongside fellow UDA member Robert Rab Carson. At traffic lights, the car stopped. Then, movement. Masked gunmen approached. No warning, no hesitation. Automatic fire tore into the vehicle at close range. Bullets ripped through the back seat, hitting Gregg multiple times. Carson was caught in the same burst. It was over in seconds. Both men were dead. The attack was swift, precise, and expected. Responsibility pointed straight toward allies of Johnny Adair. The feud that had been building inside loyalism had reached its end point. This wasn't retaliation anymore. It was elimination. And for Gregg, the war he had helped shape, control, discipline, territory, ended the only way it could in that world. In the back of a car, under gunfire, with nowhere left to run. Gregg's death didn't end the feud, it detonated it. Within hours of John Gregg being killed, the Ulster Defence Association turned on itself with full force. By February 3rd, the body count had already climbed. Killings, reprisals, targets picked off in rapid succession. This wasn't tension anymore. It was open war. The fragile structure holding the UDA together began to fracture fast. Accusations flew, betrayal, greed, control. At the centre of it all remained Johnny Adair, whose grip on West Belfast was now slipping. Warnings spread through C Company, leave or be next. And they listened. More than 100 members abandoned Adair in days. Police pressure mounted. Arrests followed. Patrols tightened, the walls closed in, and Adair's position collapsed almost overnight. By early 2003, he was gone, forced out, pushed beyond Belfast, his power broken. Gregg's death had shifted everything. What followed wasn't just retaliation, it was a purge, a move to reclaim control, to cut out what many saw as corruption, criminality, and chaos inside Loyalism. Then came the funeral. February 6, 2003, Rathcoole. Thousands gathered. Senior UDA figures stood in silence as shots rang out in salute. A final display of loyalty, of respect, of something closer to myth. Gregg wasn't buried quietly. He was marked. Murals rose soon after, his image etched into walls, framed by UDA symbols. In Loyalist areas, he wasn't remembered as just another casualty. He was something else, a man who had drawn a line and paid for it. August 27th, 1979. A bright summer afternoon on the narrow road between Newry and Warrenpool. The calm before the storm. A convoy of British paratroopers rolled past Narrowwater Castle, unaware that the Provisional IRA South Armagh Brigade had turned the roadside into a killing field. At 4:40 p.m, the first bomb erupted beneath the truck, a blast so powerful it hurled men and metal into the air. 6 soldiers were killed instantly. Survivors scrambled, guns blazing into the tree line, thinking they were under fire from across the border. Then came the second explosion. Half an hour later, as reinforcements and medics crowded the scene, a second device, hidden near the gatehouse, detonated with surgical precision. 12 more soldiers died where they stood. 18 dead in total, the single bloodiest attack on British forces during the Troubles. Across the lock, a civilian lorry driver was gunned down amid the confusion, and before the smoke cleared, news broke that Lord Mountbatten had been blown up off the coast of Sligo. Another IRA bomb the same day. It was the IRA's message to Britain: we can strike anywhere, anytime. The Warren Point ambush wasn't just an ambush, it was a demonstration. Cold, calculated, and devastating. The borderlands of South Armagh would never look peaceful again. Thomas Slab Murphy, born August 26, 1949, is a name that echoes through the shadows of modern Irish history. A man of few words, but enormous influence, Murphy was the ghost of the borderlands, reclusive, calculating, and feared. A man of few words, but enormous influence. To some, he was the quiet farmer from South Armagh. To others, the mastermind of the Provisional IRA's most feared brigade, a figure who blended militant command with the cold precision of a businessman. His farm, split by the invisible line between County Armagh and County Louth, became more than just land. It was an operation hub, a smuggler's artery pulsing with fuel, weapons, and money. Accused of everything from coordinating deadly attacks to running a multi-million-pound smuggling empire, Murphy's life reads like a collision between rebellion and organised crime. A man who lived in the grey space between patriot and outlaw. Thomas Murphy came of age in a land divided, a place where politics bled into everyday life and rebellion was part of the air people breathed. Born into a family of hardline Republicans, Murphy and his brothers were raised on stories of struggle, loyalty, and resistance. Their family farm straddled the border, half in County Armagh, half in County Louth, a fault line between two nations. It wasn't just home, it was an advantage, a perfect escape route, a perfect hiding place. The Murphys were cattle dealers by trade, known locally as the Slabs, a nickname that would follow Thomas for life. By the early 1970s, Slab had become more than a farmer. He was a rising force in the IRA's South Armagh Brigade, the most feared and efficient unit of the Troubles. They were experts in ambushes, bombings, and cross-border strikes, ghosts of the countryside who hid hard and disappeared without a trace. Murphy's climb was fast and ruthless. His discipline and cold precision drew the attention of the IRA's Army Council, who would later elevate him to Chief of Staff. From that point on, Slab wasn't just another commander, He was the strategist behind some of the most calculated and devastating attacks of the era. The 1979 Warren Point ambush, where 18 British soldiers were killed in a single afternoon, was the bloodiest blow the IRA ever dealt to the British Army, and one of the most infamous incidents linked to Murphy. On that same day, over 100 miles away, the Mullingar bombing claimed the life of Lord Louis Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma, along with 3 others, including 2 children. 2 attacks, hours apart, a message carved in fire and blood. Both attacks sent shockwaves through Britain and Ireland, cementing Murphy's reputation as a formidable figure in the IRA's militant wing. Murphy's name was whispered in the aftermath. He was never charged, never convicted, but both British intelligence and the Garda Special Branch believed he'd played a crucial hand in the operation, as part of his broader command and logistical influence within the Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade. Not as the man who pressed the button, but as the man who made it possible. By then, Murphy was thought to be the de facto commander of the IRA's South Armagh Brigade, described as the man who approved or coordinated major cross-border actions, overseeing the movement of weapons and explosives, and managing safe houses and escape routes that allowed volunteers to strike in Northern Ireland and vanish into the Republic within minutes. The Warren Point ambush, with its precision, dual explosions, and perfect exploitation of the border, bore the hallmarks of South Armagh's planning discipline, a signature often attributed to Murphy's organisational control. Sources suggested Murphy's logistical network supplied the explosives, likely stored or transported through farms under his control near Crossmaglen. Through the 1980s, Thomas Slab Murphy's reach allegedly extended far beyond the borderlands of South Armagh. By then, he was believed to be the IRA's chief of staff, the man quietly pulling strings as bombings rocked London, Belfast, and beyond. But Murphy's real power wasn't in the explosions, it was in the supply lines. Intelligence reports placed him at the centre of one of the IRA's most audacious feats, the Libyan arms connection. Shipments of rifles, explosives, and even surface-to-air missiles were ferried across the Mediterranean, bound for Irish shores. One of the skippers, Adrian Hopkins, would later testify that Murphy himself had met a Libyan agent in Greece, coordinating the transfer and personally overseeing the unloading of weapons when they reached Ireland. It was a colossal operation, tons of munitions smuggled under the nose of Western intelligence, and it confirmed what many already believed. Thomas Slab Murphy wasn't just a commander, he was the IRA's quartermaster, strategist, and banker, the man who kept the war machine alive. But soon, Thomas Slab Murphy's name was no longer whispered only in border pubs or intelligence reports. It was making front-page headlines. In 1987, the Sunday Times accused him of masterminding IRA bombing campaigns across Britain. For Murphy, it was a step too far. Furious and determined to clear his name, he sued the paper for libel in Dublin, igniting one of the most sensational trials of the decade. The courtroom became a battlefield. On one side, the reclusive border farmer, on the other, the weight of British and Irish intelligence, journalists, and ex-paramilitaries. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A victory would cleanse his reputation, a loss would brand him the very thing he denied being. The verdict fell against him. Then it was overturned on appeal, only to end in defeat once again when the retrial concluded. During that retrial, the witness list read like a roll call from the dark heart of the Troubles. Former IRA insiders Sean O'Callaghan and Aidan Collins, alongside Garda officers, customs agents, and British soldiers, all taking the stand against him. For the first time, the shadowy figure of Slab Murphy had been dragged into the light, and what the world saw only deepened his legend. Aidan Collins, who later chronicled his time inside the IRA in a tell-all memoir, never lived long enough to see its full impact. Not long after speaking out, he was brutally murdered near his home, a killing many believe was payback for his testimony against Murphy. Despite Murphy's furious denials, the jury's verdict was clear. He had been an IRA commander and a smuggler. The ruling shattered his public image and tore away what little anonymity he had left. The Sunday Times refused to back down. Instead, it doubled down, publishing new claims from Adrian Hopkins, the skipper who ferried weapons from Libya, who detailed Murphy's alleged role in orchestrating those shipments. By the time the dust settled, The trial had peeled back the layers of Murphy's secret world. What emerged was not the quiet farmer of South Armagh, but a man painted as both militant and mob boss, a figure whose shadow loomed over every gun, bomb, and deal that crossed the Irish border. As whispers of Murphy's role in the IRA grew louder, another story began to surface, one that painted him not just as a commander, but as a criminal kingpin. His farm, perched on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, was said to be more than just soil and livestock. It was the heart of a smuggling empire that stretched across 2 jurisdictions. In 2005, law enforcement on both sides of the border struck. The British Assets Recovery Agency and Ireland's Criminal Assets Bureau launched coordinated raids on Murphy-linked businesses, an unprecedented joint operation. What they uncovered was staggering: a network moving fuel, cigarettes, livestock, and grain, all washed through a web of legitimate fronts. The BBC's Underworld Rich List estimated Murphy's fortune at £4 million, much of it allegedly built from the shadows. Among the discoveries was a purpose-built underground chamber near his home, rumoured to have been used by the IRA for interrogations. It only deepened the mythology surrounding him: the farmer who was also a general, a smuggler, a ghost. Murphy hit back, issuing a rare public statement. He denied everything: smuggling, criminal ties, the lot, claiming he was just a simple farmer forced to sell land to cover legal fees from his failed libel case. But few believed him. The raids had seized tankers, shotguns, cigarettes, and nearly €1 million in cash. For the public it was clear, this was no ordinary farmer. While Murphy's alleged involvement in the IRA's military operations was under scrutiny, his name was also increasingly associated with a vast smuggling empire. The breakpoint came at dawn on March 9, 2006, when the stillness of South Armagh was shattered by flashing lights and helicopter blades. In a massive cross-border operation, police, soldiers, and customs agents from both sides of the border descended on Murphy's land. A coordinated strike aimed straight at the heart of his empire. It was one of the largest cross-border operations in modern Irish history, and its scale said everything about the man they were after. When the dust settled, investigators uncovered 4 diesel laundering plants, underground fuel tanks, and a fleet of tankers hidden across Murphy's properties. They seized computers, documents, and cash, the bones of a smuggling machine that had been running for decades. But the raids didn't just hit Murphy's business, they hit Irish politics. As headlines exploded, Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams came to Murphy's defence, declaring, "Tom Murphy is not a criminal, he is a good Republican and a key supporter of Sinn Féin's peace strategy." His statement lit a fuse. Arlene Foster, then First Minister, fired back, calling Murphy exactly what she believed he was: a criminal, one whose reputation in South Armagh spoke for itself. Even so, within Republican circles, Murphy's myth endured. But for investigators, the picture was clear. This wasn't just ideology, this was industry. And behind the farm gates, Murphy's empire was finally beginning to crumble. After decades of suspicion, raids, and rumours, Thomas Slab Murphy was finally brought down, not for bombs or smuggling, but for tax evasion. Following a relentless investigation by the Criminal Assets Bureau, a Dublin court found him guilty of 9 counts of evading tax in December 2015. It wasn't the crime the authorities had hunted him for, but it was enough. The 9-week trial, held under anti-terror legislation amid fears of jury intimidation, exposed the double life behind Murphy's farmer persona. He had failed to file tax returns between 1996 and 2004, but ledgers, diaries, and seized documents told another story, one of undeclared wealth and shadow finance. In February 2016, the verdict came down hard: 18 months in prison, no suspension. Murphy was taken straight to Portlaoise Prison, Ireland's most secure facility, the same fortress that housed paramilitaries and gangland killers. His transfer under armed escort spoke volumes. Even behind bars, he was considered dangerous. Murphy appealed in November 2016, but the Court of Appeal shut him down on every front, confirming the conviction. By January 2017, the King of South Armagh was quietly moved to the open, low-security Loughlin House, where he served the remainder of his sentence, walking free in April 2018. The man the authorities could never catch for war, they finally caught for paperwork. When Thomas Slab Murphy walked free in 2018, it felt less like an ending and more like the closing of a legend. His release marked the final act in a life that straddled two worlds, one of politics, the other of power. To some, he remains a folk hero, a symbol of resistance who stood his ground against British rule. To others, he was the very embodiment of Ireland's criminal underworld, a smuggler, a warlord, a man who blurred the line between patriot and profiteer. His story is soaked in contradiction, whispers of bombings and gun running, smuggling fortunes and shadowy meetings with revolutionaries and criminals alike. Reports claim that in later years, Murphy grew disillusioned with the peace process, drifting from Sinn Féin and cutting ties with the movement he once defined. Rumours swirled of contact with dissident Republicans, though as always, nothing was ever proven. Even now, his name hangs heavy over South Armagh, part myth, part memory. A man who built an empire from the border itself, and whose conviction for something as ordinary as tax evasion served as the state's final act of justice. For some, he was a soldier, for others, a criminal. For Ireland, he remains a reminder that in the long shadow of the Troubles, the truth is never simple, and the war never truly ends. On the late evening of July 7, 1996, a call came into the minicabs depot in Lurgan. A taxi was requested under the name Lavery, supposedly for a pickup from the local cinema and a drop-off in Adair. Michael McGoldrick, a 31-year-old Catholic father, took the job. He was working part-time as a taxi driver to support his studies at Queen's University Belfast, studies he had just completed 2 days earlier. By the next morning, McGoldrick's taxi was found abandoned on a remote country lane near Adair. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, lay McGoldrick's body. He'd been shot 5 times in the head at close range. His murder unfolded against the backdrop of the Drumcree standoff, a period of intense sectarian tension over Loyalist parades and nationalist protest. Investigators quickly came to believe the killing was not personal, it was symbolic. A Catholic civilian, chosen simply because he was behind the wheel that night. Evidence later presented in court revealed how the killers had set the trap: a fake name, a false booking, a taxi summoned into the darkness. And then came the most chilling detail. Through trial testimony and investigative reporting, it emerged that McGoldrick's murder had allegedly been carried out as a birthday present for notorious Loyalist paramilitary leader, Billy Wright, a brutal gesture meant to mark the occasion with blood. Before his name made headlines, before it carried fear, loyalty, or notoriety, Billy Wright was just a boy caught between 2 homes and one gathering storm. Born in 1960 in Wolverhampton, England, he entered a family already beginning to crack. His parents, Ulster Protestants originally from Portadown, had moved to England for work, but the marriage soon collapsed. His father, David, walked out while Billy was still young, leaving him and his 4 sisters in a household slipping into instability. When the family returned to Northern Ireland, the turmoil only deepened. The children were placed into care and separated, with Billy sent to South Armagh, a Protestant boy growing up in a predominantly Catholic, nationalist community. There his childhood unfolded in unexpected ways. He played with Catholic kids, built friendships across the divide, and even joined in Gaelic football. For a brief time, life felt normal. But in Northern Ireland, normal never lasted. The Troubles were closing in, and the conflict that surrounded him would soon shape the path he was destined to take. By the 1970s, violence in Northern Ireland wasn't a distant headline, it was a constant presence, closing in on everyday life. For Billy Wright, the conflict became personal early. Several of his relatives were killed by Republican paramilitaries. Each loss a stark reminder that the Troubles didn't spare families, they shattered them. One death cut deeper than the rest. Jim Wright, a Protestant Salvation Army member, former RUC reservist, and father of 4, was killed in July 1977 when the INLA planted a bomb beneath his car. The blast didn't just take a life, it tore a wound through the community. 10,000 mourners attended Jim Wright's funeral, a sea of grief and anger that showed just how deeply the violence had seeped into daily existence. For Billy, still just a teenager, the bombing's aftermath was unforgettable. It taught him how fragile life was, how permanent loss could be, and how quickly neighbours could turn into enemies. The world around him forced harsh lessons early. Loyalty mattered, fear was constant, and community lines were drawn deep. Growing up Protestant in a largely nationalist area, he lived between two identities, watching and absorbing everything. By adolescence, the violence on the streets and the losses in his family had already shaped him, sharpening instincts that would later pull him toward far darker paths. By the mid-1970s, the violence that had shaped Billy Wright's early life closed in on him personally. In 1976, in the tense aftermath of the Kingsmill massacre, which left 10 Protestant workers dead, the 15-year-old took his first decisive step into the world that would define him. He joined the youth wing of the Ulster Volunteer Force. For a boy still learning how to survive, the UVF offered something he never truly had: identity, structure, and a sense of purpose in a society split down the middle. It didn't take long for consequences to arrive. Wright was soon arrested for hijacking and firearms offences and sentenced to 6 years in the prison of Boston, County Down. The experience changed him. Inside, he met hardened loyalists, absorbed the unspoken rules of status and survival, and learned that reputation, feared or respected, was his own form of power. He served just over half his sentence, walking out in 1980 with sharper instincts, a harder edge, and a clearer understanding of both the dangers and the opportunities awaiting him in Mid-Ulster. After his release, Wright returned to Portadown and tried to live a normal life. He married, had 2 daughters, sold insurance, and even preached as a born-again Christian. But the calm was only a facade. Loyalist networks still pulled at him, and in the early 1980s, his name began resurfacing within the UVF's Mid-Ulster Brigade. Throughout the decade, Wright racked up arrests, assaults, weapons charges, intimidation, though convictions were few. What mattered more were the alliances he forged and the reputation he cultivated. By the late 1980s, he was no longer just another loyalist. He was a rising force, gaining influence and control within Mid-Ulster loyalist circles. By the late 1980s, Wright's influence was no longer whispered. It was accepted. He had carved out a reputation for ruthlessness and decisive action, traits that quickly elevated him within loyalist circles. As the 1990s approached, he rose to command the UVF's Mid-Ulster Brigade, a unit linked to a string of brutal sectarian killings. Though he was never formally convicted of murder, intelligence reports and local accounts connected him to dozens of shootings, assassinations, and bomb attacks. The boy who once played Gaelic football in Catholic South Armagh had become a man whose name carried fear on both sides of the divide, a figure for whom power, loyalty, and violence had become inseparable. From 1991 onward, the bloodshed intensified. 3 Catholics were killed in a mobile shop attack in Craigavon, an operation linked to Wright's Mid-Ulster network. In 1992, 5 people died in the Sean Graham Bookmakers Massacre. In 1994, 6 more were murdered during the Locken Island Massacre as they watched the World Cup. Only years later, through declassified files, would the extent of the support Wright's unit received become clear, exposing a blurred line between paramilitaries and elements within the security forces. These attacks were not random outbursts, they were calculated displays of control and intimidation. Subsequent investigations and police ombudsman reports confirmed that systematic failures, and at times direct collusion, allowed Wright's men to operate with near immunity. Intelligence was mishandled, surveillance faltered, and RUC officers were found to have passed information to his unit or shielded suspects from charges. In Mid-Ulster, the effect was unmistakable. Wright's grip tightened, and for many, the law felt less like protection and more like another force enabling his reign. By the mid-1990s, Billy Wright's name carried a gravity far beyond Portadown. As a commander of the UVF's Mid-Ulster Brigade, he was known for precision, ruthlessness, and a readiness to act when others held back. Under his leadership, the brigade carried out a string of sectarian killings, drive-bys, targeted shootings, cold, calculated hits, each one sharpening the fear surrounding his name. But Northern Ireland was shifting. Ceasefires were declared, negotiations advanced, and the peace process inched forward. To many it signalled hope. To Wright, it signalled betrayal. He saw compromise as capitulation, a dangerous weakening that would leave Loyalist communities exposed. Inside the UVF, fault lines opened. Some were willing to engage with political progress. Others, Wright chief among them, rejected it outright. The battle lines were no longer just between Loyalists and Republicans, but within Loyalism itself. The Drum Creek standoff in July 1996 brought those internal tensions to a breaking point. The Orange Order's push to march down the mainly Catholic Garvey Road ignited Portadown, and the volatile standoff gave Billy Wright the perfect stage to assert his authority. Amid the chaos, his men abducted and murdered Michael McGoldrick, the Catholic taxi driver. The execution-style killing was both a message and a challenge. It signaled that Wright would act on his own terms, regardless of political negotiations or fragile ceasefires. To the UVF leadership, the murder was a reckless provocation, threatening not only the organization's ceasefire, but the fragile momentum of the peace process itself. Wright wasn't just defying the state, he was defying his own command. When the UVF expelled Billy Wright, ordering him to stand down and leave Northern Ireland, it should have ended his influence. Instead, it amplified it. Wright had built loyalty that ran deeper than organizational ties. His followers feared him, trusted him, and were willing to break ranks for him. Rather than disappear, he used the expulsion as a springboard, creating the Loyalist Volunteer Force, a group loyal not to the UVF, but to Wright alone. The LVF announced itself with spectacle and bloodshed. Thousands gathered in Portadown as Wright denounced political compromise, and soon the group began a string of sectarian killings, each one reinforcing its reputation for decisive, uncompromising violence. By 1997, the LVF had carried out more than a dozen sectarian attacks, including multiple drive-by shootings on Catholic homes and workers. One of the most chilling was the murder of John Slane. Slane, a young Catholic father, was in his West Belfast home boiling a kettle to make bottles for his newborn twin daughters when two unmasked Loyalist gunmen burst in from across the motorway. They shot him dead in his own kitchen, a killing as brazen as it was brutal. A decade later, the chief suspect in Slane's murder met a grisly fate of his own. His dismembered remains were discovered in a rubbish bin. Wright's name had become a byword for unpredictability, and his men obeyed him without question. He understood the power of fear. Every killing, every drive-by, every pub shooting was a message meant to solidify his control and prove loyalty to the LVF. Despite the trail of blood linked to his name, Wright had largely slipped through the justice system. The charge that finally put him behind bars was almost mundane by comparison, threatening to kill Gwen Reed, a woman who had witnessed an LVF punishment attack. It wasn't one of the sectarian murders that made him infamous, but it was enough. In January 1997, Wright was sentenced to 8 years and sent to the Maze Prison, Northern Ireland's most secure and politically charged jail. For the first time in years, the man who had dominated Mid-Ulster found himself locked in a place built to contain the very violence he helped unleash. Even behind bars, Wright's influence never truly diminished. His presence dominated the Maze's corridors, and he was believed to be directing LVF operations through trusted intermediaries. Both Loyalist and Republican inmates knew his reputation and treated it with caution. By the end of 1997, his violent legacy felt unshakable. But the boy who once roamed Catholic streets in South Armagh now faced a new and unfamiliar vulnerability: the prison system itself. Within weeks, that vulnerability would be exploited in a way that stunned Northern Ireland. On the 27th of December 1997, Billy Wright's fearsome reputation met its reckoning. He was being escorted for a routine visit with his girlfriend, a simple movement inside what was supposed to be one of the most secure prisons in Northern Ireland. But in seconds, routine turned lethal. 3 INLA prisoners, armed with smuggled pistols, ambushed him as he climbed into the prison van. A chain of staggering security failures, a disabled CCTV camera, an unmanned watchtower, and a cut fence left unrepaired gave the attackers exactly the opening they needed. They fired repeatedly at point-blank range. The man who had terrorized towns and commanded obedience through violence died almost instantly. The aftermath of Wright's killing was immediate and electric. Inside the maze, officers panicked, inmates froze, and word spread across Northern Ireland within minutes. His funeral in Portadown drew thousands, Loyalists, family and locals all grappling with the legacy he left behind. For some it was grief, for others a reminder of the violence he had carved into their communities. His death left a clear void in the Loyalist power structure. Soon the questions began. Why was Wright kept in the same block as sworn enemies? How did guns make it into a maximum security prison? Why were cameras down, watchtowers empty, and a cut fence left unrepaired? Was this a chain of blunders, or something orchestrated? The Bachelor inquiry probed every detail of the 27th of December 1997. Counsel Alan Kane put the core question plainly. Was Wright's death a tragic failure of security, or the result of deliberate collusion? Evidence pointed to systemic breakdowns in surveillance, intelligence, and basic prison procedures that created the perfect opening for the assassins. And overshadowing it all was the earlier comment from Chief Constable Sir Hugh Annesley. It's just a question of who gets to the bastard first. Us, the IRA, or the UVF. In a conflict where loyalties blurred and lines of authority frayed, Wright's murder forced Northern Ireland to confront how close those worlds had come to merging. Billy Wright's assassination left an indelible mark on Northern Ireland's fragile peace process. At the time, tensions were extremely high, and the murder risked destabilizing both Loyalist and Republican ceasefires. Officials later reflected on the delicate balancing act required to prevent retaliatory violence while keeping negotiations alive. 4 months later, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, a historic but fragile step toward peace. Yet Billy Wright's influence did not end with his death. His shadow lingered across Mid-Ulster. Without him, the LVF quickly fractured. What had been a tightly controlled force splintered into rival factions, his power fading as Northern Ireland moved, however cautiously, toward a new era. The communities he scarred were left with lasting wounds, families grieving, neighborhoods marked by shootings, and memories of sectarian violence that time could not easily erase. Still, within loyalism, Wright remained a polarizing figure, feared, admired, and condemned in equal measure. It was a cold March night in Lurgan, a town in Northern Ireland. 3 young Republicans left the local Royal Ulster Constabulary barracks, walking into the dark, their breath visible in the still air. They were marked men, watched, known, and hunted. Moments later, the quiet shattered. Gunfire erupted from the shadows, bullets tearing through the night. Masked gunmen from the Ulster Volunteer Force, a Loyalist paramilitary group, had opened fire. The men dived for cover as the street lit up with muzzle flashes, a storm of violence lasting only seconds, but echoing for decades. When the gunfire stopped, the ground was slick with blood. 2 of the men were wounded, and 1 lay dead on the pavement. As he drew his last breaths, he uttered words that would haunt Northern Ireland for decades. "We were let out to be set up." Within hours, whispers of collusion spread like wildfire. Claims that the Loyalist gunmen had been tipped off by British security forces. For many in the Republican community, it wasn't just an ambush, it was an execution, sanctioned by the state. In the heart of Northern Ireland, where the line between war and peace was little more than a flicker in the smoke, one name echoed through the shadows: Colin Duffy. Born in 1968 to a Catholic family in Lurgan, County Armagh, Duffy's life would become a story of rebellion, survival, and unrelenting controversy. He grew up in the heart of a storm, a childhood shaped by the chaos and bloodshed of the Troubles. Sectarian hatred, political violence, and generations of grief hung heavy over the town of Lurgan, where British patrols and paramilitary gunfire were as common as the church bells. It was an environment that hardened everyone it touched, forging a boy who would one day become one of the most polarizing figures to emerge from Northern Ireland's dark and divided history. Lurgan itself was a town carved in two, Catholics on one side, Protestants on the other, with fear and suspicion filling the space in between. Bombings rattled windows, British soldiers patrolled the streets. Every corner carried a quiet threat. In the 1970s and 1980s, neutrality was a luxury few could afford. In a world where choosing a side was a matter of survival, young Colin Duffy made his choice early, and there would be no turning back. From a young age, Colin Duffy was swept into the storm of Republican resistance. In the streets of Lurgan, the Irish Republican Army wasn't just a militant force, it was a symbol. To many young Catholics, it stood as the only shield against a government they believed had turned its back on them, a banner of defiance in a land that offered little justice. By his teenage years, Duffy had taken the leap. He joined the Provisional IRA, the armed vanguard of the Republican movement, and soon became active within Sinn Féin, its political counterpart. The deeper he went, the more unwavering his convictions became. He spoke out for Irish unity, not as an abstract dream, but as a moral duty, a cause worth fighting and dying for. But that belief came at a price. It marked him as a target for the British state and for the Loyalist gunmen who patrolled the other side of the divide. March 7th, 1990, a night that would change Colin Duffy's life forever. After signing bail at the RUC barracks in Lurgan, Duffy walked into the darkness alongside fellow Republicans Sam Marshall and Tony McCoy. They hadn't gone far when the quiet streets erupted. From the shadows, masked gunmen from the Ulster Volunteer Force opened fire, leaving Duffy and McCoy wounded and Sam Marshall dead. Within minutes, soldiers and police swarmed the scene, but to locals, their presence felt less like protection and more like confirmation of a setup. Whispers spread, collusion, betrayal, revenge. That night became more than an ambush. It became a symbol of the chaos that still haunted Northern Ireland, where truth and violence walked hand in hand through the dark. One name cast a long shadow over the ambush: Robin Jackson. To those who knew the dark underworld of Loyalist paramilitaries, he was the Jackal, a ghostly figure whispered about in pubs and police reports alike, a man linked to some of the bloodiest massacres of the Troubles, yet one who somehow always slipped through the cracks of justice. Witnesses later claimed they'd seen someone matching Jackson's description near the Lurgan RUC barracks on a previous evening, the very place where Duffy, Marshall, and McCoy had signed their bail. The implication was chilling. If true, it meant the ambush had been more than coincidence. It had been orchestrated. Despite years of suspicion and rumour, no one was ever charged with Sam Marshall's murder. The attack deepened the gulf between Northern Ireland's divided communities and hardened the resolve of men like Colin Duffy, who now saw himself not as a criminal, but as a soldier in a war without rules. But the 1990 ambush was only the beginning. 5 years later, in 1995, Duffy was arrested and charged with the murder of John Linus, a former soldier in the Ulster Defence Regiment. The case ignited headlines and reopened old wounds. The prosecution's star witness was Lindsay Robb, a UVF member who claimed to have insider knowledge of the plot. For a time, his testimony threatened to seal Duffy's fate, resulting in Duffy's conviction. But Robb's credibility soon exploded when he was caught gunrunning in Scotland, exposing him as both a liar and a hypocrite. With the case in ruins, Duffy walked free, his conviction quashed in appeal. To many in the Republican movement, it wasn't just an acquittal, it was vindication. Proof, they said, that the justice system had been wielded as a weapon, and that Colin Duffy had survived yet another attempt to silence him. Throughout Colin Duffy's battles with the courts, one name stood firmly by his side: Rosemary Nelson. A fearless human rights lawyer, Nelson had built a reputation for defending those the system had already condemned in the courts of public opinion. She took on cases others wouldn't touch, challenging the might of the state at a time when doing so could be a death sentence. But her courage made her a target. Threats poured in from Loyalist groups and, chillingly, from members of the very security forces sworn to uphold the law. Then, in 1999, the threats became reality. A bomb planted beneath her car exploded outside her home, killing her instantly. The murder sent shockwaves across Northern Ireland, a brutal message to anyone who dared to stand up to the system. For Colin Duffy, it was more than a loss of a lawyer. It was the loss of an ally and a symbol of resistance. Her death hardened him further, deepening his belief that justice in Northern Ireland was an illusion reserved for one side only. But Duffy's own battles were far from over. Just 2 years after his release in 1997, he was once again thrust into the spotlight, charged with the murders of RUC constables John Graham and David Johnston, shot dead while on foot patrol in Lurgan town centre. The evidence was thin, circumstantial, inconsistent, and built largely on shaky witness testimony and forensic guesswork. Yet the case dragged on, another chapter in Duffy's long war with the state. When the charges were finally dropped, Northern Ireland was once again split down the middle. To his supporters, it was proof that Duffy was the victim of a corrupt system designed to break him. To his critics, it was just another escape for a man they believed had blood on his hands. As the millennium dawned, Northern Ireland was beginning to breathe again. The guns had mostly fallen silent, and the fragile promise of peace hung in the air. But amid this uneasy calm, one name refused to fade from the headlines: Colin Duffy. In March 2009, Duffy was arrested and charged in connection with one of the most shocking attacks of the post-Troubles era, the Messerine Barracks shooting. 2 British soldiers, Patrick Asimcar and Mark Quincy, were gunned down as they collected pizzas from a delivery driver outside the Antrim base. The attack, claimed by the real IRA, sent shockwaves through a society still trying to heal, and it came just days after police had warned of a rising threat from dissident Republicans. The case exploded into a media storm. For some, it was a grim reminder that the old war had never truly ended. For others, it was an attempt by the state to reopen wounds best left closed. The prosecution's case hinged on a single piece of evidence, a trace of Duffy's DNA found on a latex glove inside a getaway car. But the defense tore holes in the narrative, arguing that the DNA was minute, inconclusive, and far from proof of guilt. After years of legal wrangling, on January 20th, 2012, the verdict was delivered. Colin Duffy was acquitted. His co-accused, Brian Shivers, was initially convicted, only for his conviction to later collapse amid procedural failures and revelations about his terminal illness. For Duffy, it was another narrow escape in a lifetime of them, a man forever walking the line between myth and menace, freedom and fate. The Messerine trial may have ended, but Colin Duffy's time in the spotlight was far from over. On September 8, 2012, Duffy stood before a silent crowd at the funeral of Alan Ryan, a real IRA member gunned down in Dublin. As the tricolour draped the coffin, Duffy entered a fiery graveside oration, defiant, unapologetic, and unmistakably political. He hailed Ryan as a brave Irish Republican and a fearless IRA volunteer, urging continued resistance against what he called foreign interference in our country. The words reverberated far beyond the cemetery gates. To supporters, it was a call to remember the past. To critics, it was a warning, proof that the old embers of war still burned beneath Northern Ireland's uneasy peace. Then, just 2 months later, the headlines returned. On November 2nd, 2012, Duffy was arrested once again, this time accused of involvement in the murder of David Black, a prison officer ambushed and shot dead on the M1 motorway between Lurgan and Portadown. The killing, a brazen attack on a member of the security services, sent shockwaves through the country and reignited fears that the Troubles were not as far behind as many had hoped. The following year brought more charges, allegations of IRA membership and conspiring to possess firearms and explosives with intent to endanger life, relating to an alleged gun attack on PSNI vehicles in North Belfast in December 2013. As before, Duffy's defence tore into the evidence, branding it speculative and politically motivated. After 2 years behind bars awaiting trial, he was released on bail in February 2016, walking free once more, but leaving behind a storm of controversy, unanswered questions, and the lingering sense that Colin Duffy's story was not yet finished. Finally, on the 21st of March 2024, in what was described as one of Northern Ireland's longest-running trials, Duffy and co-accused Henry Fitzsimmons were acquitted on all charges after the judge ruled that the covert audio evidence did not meet the required standard. The shadow of the Troubles didn't end with Colin Duffy, it stretched across his entire family. His brothers, Paul and Damien, along with his cousin Shane, were all drawn into the same turbulent current, each facing charges linked to paramilitary activity and terrorism. Like Colin, all were ultimately acquitted, but not before enduring years of scrutiny, suspicion, and stigma. To many, the Duffys became the embodiment of a family under siege, a clan shaped, scarred, and defined by the conflict that consumed their homeland. Even today, their name carries weight in Republican circles. Colin's sister-in-law, Mandy Duffy, remains a vocal presence within SORA, the political voice of the hardline Republican movement that refuses to accept the peace settlement as the final chapter. Together, the Duffy family represents something larger than themselves, a living reminder of Northern Ireland's tangled legacy, where family, politics, and conflict remain inseparable threads in the same story. To his supporters, Colin Duffy is a symbol of resistance, a man who stood unbroken against the system they believe sought to destroy him. To his critics, he's the spectre of the past, a symbol of the violence, division, and bitterness that kept Northern Ireland bleeding for decades. His journey, from a boy growing up under the watchful eyes of British patrols in Lurgan, to a man repeatedly accused and acquitted of some of the most serious crimes of the Troubles, mirrors the contradictions of the land itself, a place forever wrestling with its own history. Colin Duffy's story is not one of endings, but of echoes. Even now, as Northern Ireland walks the uneasy path of peace, his name lingers, a reminder that not all wounds have healed and not all battles have been laid to rest. The questions remain: can a society so deeply scarred ever truly move on? Can men like Duffy find redemption in peace after a lifetime shaped by war? And what does justice mean in a place where every truth has two sides? For decades, Colin Duffy has stood at the fault line between rebellion and reconciliation, a man as defiant as he is divisive. His life mirrors Northern Ireland itself, haunted by its past, uncertain of its future, and forever caught between the ghosts of war and the fragile promise of peace. That was it for today's video. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see our next videos. On the 28th of May 2003, 21-year-old Alan McCullough stepped out of his mother's house on Denmark Street in North Belfast. Two men were waiting for him, both members of the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA. There was no struggle, no raised voices, just a short walk to the car and the door closing behind him. McCullough was a member of the same Loyalist paramilitary group. He had risen through the ranks of the UDA to become military commander of the West Belfast Brigade's feared C Company, the faction led by Johnny Mad Dog Adair during some of the bloodiest internal Loyalist feuds. But in that world, power shifted fast, and suspicion was a death sentence. In February 2003, after being suspected of involvement in the killing of South East Antrim Brigadier John Gregg, a rival of Adair, McCullough was forced out of Northern Ireland. A few months later, he returned to Belfast. A month after that, the two UDA men arrived at his door. They drove away together, and McCullough was never seen again. In the shadows of East Belfast, where murals still whispered the language of war, one name carried quiet weight: Mo Courtney. He wasn't a loud loyalist, no headline-chasing gunman. He was something more careful. Police would later describe him as a man standing at the crossroads of paramilitarism and profit, a senior red-hand commando figure ultimately convicted in a multi-million-pound organised crime case. But his story didn't begin there. Before the courtrooms and conspiracy charges, Courtney had moved through the ranks of loyalism, a former Ulster Defence Association activist and a leading figure within Johnny Adair's infamous C Company, one of the most feared factions of the UDA during its bloodiest feuds. The ceasefires came, the politics shifted, but some men didn't fade into history. They recalibrated. So the question remains, was Mo Courtney a soldier who turned to crime, or a crime boss who wore a paramilitary badge? William Samuel Mo Courtney was born in Belfast on the 8th of July 1963, into a city already tightening its fists. By the late 1970s, he was running with a gang of teenage boys from the Shankill Road and the surrounding streets. They gathered near the Buffs Club on Century Street, restless, angry, looking for purpose. One of them was Johnny Mad Dog Adair. The friendship would shape everything that followed. In 1984, the group filtered into C8, one of the teams that formed C Company of the Ulster Freedom Fighters, the UDA's most feared battalion. What began as street loyalty hardened into paramilitary discipline. Over months, they were absorbed into a structure built for violence. On the 23rd of November 1985, Courtney and Adair stood shoulder to shoulder at Belfast City Hall for the Ulster Says No rally, protesting the Anglo-Irish Agreement. The political deal ignited fury in Loyalist areas, and recruitment surged. C Company grew, so did the bloodshed. Courtney's early reputation wasn't ideological. He was known as a petty thief, even subjected to a punishment beating by senior UDA figures for burglaries on the Shankill. But he didn't drift away. Instead, he was pulled deeper. William Winky Dodds, an older family friend, was the one who changed everything. He began with Courtney alone, taking him aside and teaching him how to handle weapons, how to move, how to think like a soldier. Soon, Adair and others from Old Park were brought in. What had started as a loose gang of teenagers was reshaped into something far more disciplined and far more dangerous. They weren't just being taught to fight, they were being prepared for active service. What had been street bravado became something more organised, more deliberate. By the mid to late 1980s, Courtney was operating as a gunman. By 1987, he was allegedly involved in killings.
To hit back at them? To hit back, yes. To shoot them? To shoot them, to do whatever means possible.
In West Belfast, he would go on to lead an active service unit, a small, tightly controlled team tasked with carrying out attacks. Years later, in 2002, he was questioned in connection with the 1989 murder of solicitor Pat Finucane. No charges followed, but by then, Mo Courtney was no longer a teenager outside a club on Century Street. He was a man fully shaped for the war, and the war was far from finished with him. By the late 1980s, Mo Courtney's loyalty was no longer unquestioning. Inside the UDA, frustration was building. Younger hardliners believed the leadership had grown comfortable, more interested in extortion, racketeering, and lining their own pockets than in fighting Republicans. Courtney was one of those who argued the movement had lost its edge. In his view, the war wasn't being fought hard enough. Whispers of internal revolt followed. Courtney became linked to attempts to unseat the UDA's senior figures, power plays that ultimately collapsed, not because peace had broken out, but because the Stevens inquiries began exposing links between Loyalist paramilitaries and elements within the security forces. As scrutiny intensified, the old leadership fell away. A new order emerged in the 1990s. Courtney was part of it, aligned closely with Johnny Adair. In 1991, Courtney was jailed for robbery, theft, and hijacking. Inside the Maze prison, he did not fade into the background. Alongside Adair and Loyalist gunman Michael Stone, he became a prominent figure among the Loyalist inmates. At one point, they even met DUP politician and then Lord Mayor of Belfast, Reverend Eric Smith, to discuss the possibility of future prisoner releases, a sign of how blurred the lines between politics and paramilitarism had become. Prison didn't soften him. He built a reputation as a fearsome fighter, and when loyalism turned on itself in 2000, during the bitter feud between Adair's C Company and the UVF, Courtney took a leading role. On the 19th of August 2000, the Loyalist feud exploded onto the Shankill Road. During the so-called Day of Culture, gunmen opened fire on UVF members barricaded inside the Rex Bar. Courtney was identified as one of the shooters. 3 were wounded, others were beaten in the street as C Company asserted control. The war inside loyalism was no longer hidden. Adair was soon back in prison. Behind bars, he aligned himself with the Shukri brothers of North Belfast. On the outside, Courtney and other Adair loyalists followed suit, and the focus shifted from ideology to profit. Drugs replaced politics. Power now meant territory. Territory meant narcotics, and narcotics meant money. By then, the war had changed. So had the men inside it. Courtney and figures aligned with him, including D. Coleman, were increasingly linked to large-scale narcotics activity in West Belfast. Coleman wasn't a public UDA figurehead. He operated inside the Loyalist Underworld, part of the old C Company power base that had shifted from paramilitary violence to organised crime. The structures built for conflict were now moving drugs. In the Loyalist heartland, cocaine and heroin replaced political slogans. Control of territory meant control of supply, and those who once enforced ideology were were now widely associated with enforcing profit. C Company hadn't disappeared, it had evolved, with Courtney and Coleman running narco rackets and flooding the area with cocaine and heroin. In late 2002, Adair and John Wright were expelled from the UDA. Courtney stood by a mad dog, acting as chief guard of the heavily fortified Shankill home dubbed the Big Brother House. But distrust was creeping in. Adair grew suspicious of Courtney's ties to the shoot grease, men he now viewed as rivals. Believing betrayal was imminent, he allegedly dispatched a hit team. Courtney survived, tipped off at the last moment by someone inside C Company. From then on, the alliance was dead. Then, in February 2003, Southeast Antrim Brigadier John Gregg, one of Johnny Adair's fiercest rivals, was shot dead in a taxi near Belfast docks. Adair was widely believed to be involved. Loyalism erupted. On the day of Gregg's funeral, armed UDA men descended on Adair's boundary way home. The message was simple: go. Police arrested Adair soon after. Without him, C Company collapsed. The unit that had ruled West Belfast fractured almost overnight. Adair's wife Gina, John White, and about 20 loyalists, including Alan McCullough, fled to Scotland and England. However, exile was less glamorous than it sounded. McCullough ended up in Lancashire with the so-called Bolton Wanderers. His girlfriend returned home with their child. He was left sleeping on a camp bed in Gina Adair's house, sharing space with other displaced loyalists. By April, he wanted back. Homesick and isolated, McCullough contacted Mo Courtney, now the dominant force in West Belfast, asking permission to return. His mother reportedly pleaded his case. Desperate to prove himself, McCullough was later linked to a shooting attack on Gina Adair's house in Bolton, a signal that he had switched sides. He also offered Courtney something more concrete: the location of a buried drugs haul and other sensitive information tied to Adair's circle. A deal was struck, and Alan McCullough came home. Back to Belfast, back to the organisation, back into the grip of men who never forgot and rarely forgave. And when those two UDA men arrived at Alan McCullough's home, they reassured his mother he would be safe. McCullough left with them willingly. At first, nothing seemed unusual. They drove to the Hilton Hotel in Temple Patrick, sat down for a meal, and talked. The conversation, it was later reported, centred on the Bolton Wanderers, Adair's exiled loyalists, and the location of hidden drug caches. It felt like business. On the way back, the car pulled over. There was a struggle. McCullough was shot twice in the head. He vanished. For days, police searched. Then, on June 5th, workmen in Mallusk, Newton Abbey, noticed disturbed ground. Beneath it lay McCullough's body, buried in a shallow grave. The UDA claimed responsibility under its cover name, the Ulster Freedom Fighters. The killing, they said, was retaliation for McCullough's alleged role in John Gregg's death. But the execution was about more than revenge. After Gregg's killing, the mainstream UDA, under Jackie MacDonald, turned on Adair. Loyalists were given a choice: defect or be swept aside. Word spread that an assault on Adair's Boundary Way base was coming. Mo Courtney saw which way the wind was blowing. Adair's grip was slipping. Survival meant switching sides. In a calculated move, Courtney confronted Adair's mother-in-law, demanding the location of hidden weapons. When she couldn't deliver, he found an arms dump himself, seizing guns and cash, and handed them over at the Heather Social Club, the new centre of power on the Shankill. There, he broke publicly with Adair, calling him a treacherous bastard for the alleged hit attempt. The old regime was being torn down, brick by brick. Courtney regained his influence within the West Belfast UDA and replaced Fat Jackie Thompson as brigadier. He was back in control. As a result, it was he who Alan McCullough, tired, isolated, and desperate in exile in Bolton, called asking for permission to return home. He got his answer. McCullough's murder shocked even hardened loyalists on the lower Shankill. The manner of it, the deception, the meal, the shallow grave, left a sour taste. Courtney, still viewed by some as too close to Adair for comfort, went into hiding, fearing retaliation. Within days, he and Ehab Shukri were arrested and charged with the killing. Courtney was found hiding in Carrickfergus. By then, Courtney's alliance with Coleman had imploded. What had once been a partnership built on territory and profit collapsed into open hostility, accusations, threats, shifting allegiances. In that world, fractures don't mend, they calcify. At one stage, tensions escalated so sharply that Coleman was effectively pushed out of Belfast after his home was allegedly targeted. Sources later claimed Courtney had placed him under threat. Without his former associate, Courtney faced pressure from rival dealers circling the same ground, and by most accounts, he had never fully replaced the man who had once helped him hold it together. Then, in 2006, Courtney was acquitted in the McCullough case of the Diplock coup, the judge citing weaknesses in the evidence of family members and an anonymous witness. But the case didn't end there. The Court of Appeal later ruled the acquittal unsound and ordered a retrial. Before it could begin, in January 2007, Courtney was brutally attacked on the Shankill Road by an old UDF rival, a reminder that post-feuds never fully fade. At the retrial, Courtney pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He received an 8-year sentence. His account was that he believed McCullough was to be kneecapped, a punishment shooting, and that someone else had fired the fatal shots. Even in prison, Mo Courtney's past followed him. In 2007, while serving time for the McCullough killing, he was named in a Belfast court affidavit as one of 2 alleged gunmen in the 1989 murder of Pat Finucane, a solicitor with a reputation of being the IRA's lawyer. No charges followed, but the allegation resurfaced old shadows. After his release, Courtney returned to Glencairn. The violence didn't stay behind him. In 2013, he was convicted of assaulting Tracy Coulter at a Lower Shankill community office. The confrontation reportedly stemmed from tensions over drugs and local power. Coulter, daughter of slain Loyalist Jackie Coulter, later saw her home destroyed in an arson attack. She blamed the UDA. Courtney was soon back in court, convicted of harassment and threatening campaigner Raymond McCord. He received a suspended sentence. But the deeper conflict was inside loyalism itself. By 2013, a bitter feud had erupted within the UDA's North Belfast Brigade. Dissidents sought to remove Brigadier John Bunting. West Belfast and Courtney were widely linked to the challenge. The organisation fractured again. Senior UDA figures reportedly offered reconciliation on one condition: Courtney and his allies step aside. They refused. Years after the ceasefires, the war for control hadn't ended. It had simply turned inward. Now, according to recent reports, Courtney has reached back into his past, contacting former ally D. Coleman and signalling that the door is open for a return. This, despite Coleman serving time for offences including kidnapping, cocaine dealing, and a violent assault. Courtney has reportedly told him there is still a place waiting. Even from behind bars, Coleman is said to have maintained contacts within the drug trade, contacts Courtney believes could reinforce his grip on the Shankill market, especially as independent dealers chip away at his influences. For Coleman, the offer is simple: a return to familiar territory. But old betrayals linger. Sources suggest he has not forgotten the fallout, and trust in that world is a rare commodity. Whether the old partnership can be rebuilt, or whether it would ignite another feud, only time will tell. Belfast, 1970s. A man walks home at night. He stopped, asked one question: "Are you a Catholic?" If he answers wrong, he doesn't die quickly. He disappears, and his body is found hours later, mutilated beyond recognition. This wasn't random violence. This was the work of one man, Lenny Murphy, the most sadistic killer of the Troubles. To understand Lenny Murphy, you have to understand where he came from. This wasn't just crime. This was Belfast, in the middle of a war. By the early 1970s, Northern Ireland had collapsed into chaos. The streets weren't safe. Neighbourhoods became battlegrounds, split by religion, identity, and fear. Catholic, Protestant. Those weren't just labels. They could decide whether you lived or died. Bombs tore through city centres. Gunmen ruled the night. British soldiers stood on corners, rifles raised, watching everything. Communities were cut off. Peace walls divided neighbour from neighbour. And on the Shankill Road, where Murphy grew up, violence wasn't something you heard about. It was something you lived. Every day. Paramilitary groups took control. Republicans like the IRA on one side, Loyalists like the UVF on the other, each prepared to do whatever it took. But even in a city used to bombs, to shootings, to death, what came next was different. Because this wasn't strategy, it wasn't politics, it wasn't even revenge. This was something far darker, and at the centre of it was one man. He wasn't born into power, he wasn't even the oldest son. Lenny Murphy was the youngest of 3 brothers, raised on the Shankill Road in Belfast. His father was a dock labourer, like his father before him. Hard work, long hours, a life that didn't leave much room for anything else. The family moved often, until they settled in Percy Street, in the lower Shankill. And this is where things start to matter, because Percy Street wasn't just another road, it sat right on the edge of 2 worlds. One side, Protestant, the other, Catholic. And before the peace walls went up, those worlds collided, every single day. Even as a child, Murphy stood out. At school, he was already known for carrying a knife. He wasn't alone either. His older brothers backed him up, and by the age of 12, he already had his first conviction: theft. But that wasn't the real warning sign. The real warning sign was how comfortable he was with violence. Even his name became part of his story. Murphy refused to use his first name, Hugh, because in Belfast, names mattered, and Hugh Murphy sounded too close to something else. Something Catholic. In a city divided by identity, even that could be dangerous. And over time, that division turned into something deeper. Hatred. Murphy spoke about Catholics constantly, not as people, but as enemies, as targets. By 16, he had left school, and like many young men around him, he joined a paramilitary group, the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. And in 1969, as riots tore through Belfast, Murphy was right there in the middle of it. This wasn't just exposure to violence anymore, this was participation. On the surface, Murphy lived a normal life. He worked as a shop assistant, he socialised, drank heavily, surrounded himself with friends and young women. But underneath that, something else was growing, because crime wasn't just part of his life anymore, it was becoming who he was. By the early 1970s, Murphy had crossed the line. According to later accounts, he was already involved in multiple killings, and by the age of 20, he was already a murderer, not suspected, not linked, a killer. In 1972, a man named William Pavis was shot dead in his home. Murphy was arrested, identified by witnesses, put in a police lineup. But before the process could even begin, Murphy caused a disturbance and stepped out. Chaos followed, and that chaos would later help him walk free. Because even though witnesses picked him out, the case collapsed, and Murphy was acquitted. But something else happened, something even darker. The man arrested with him died in prison. Cyanide. A suicide note was found taking full responsibility and clearing Murphy, but many believed it wasn't suicide at all. It was control, even from behind bars. In 1975, Murphy was back on the streets, older, more experienced, and far more dangerous. He had a wife, a child, a home on the Shankill, but he wasn't settling down. If anything, he was just getting started. Nights were spent in pubs, Places like the Brown Bear and the Lornbrook Social Club. Drinking, talking, building connections. This is where reputations were made. One night, Murphy walked out of the Bayardo bar on Aberdeen Street just minutes before it was attacked. A bombing, gunfire, multiple people killed. He survived by 10 minutes, and moments like that only reinforced something in his mind, that he was untouchable. And then, everything changed. Because Murphy didn't just want to be part of violence anymore. He wanted to control it. With his brother, he began forming a group, not small, not disorganized, a gang of more than 20 men, loyal, ruthless, ready to follow orders. One of his key lieutenants, William Moore. Together they would become something Belfast had never seen before, a gang that didn't just kill, but hunted. They would be known as the Shankill Butchers. At first, it didn't look different from the violence already happening in Belfast. In October 1975, Murphy and his gang entered a warehouse. What followed left 4 people dead. 2 men, 2 women, shot during what was described as a robbery. But this wasn't about money, it was something else. And over the next few months, that became clear. Because Murphy changed the rules. This wasn't targeted, this wasn't strategic, this was random. Late at night, vans would move through Belfast streets, men walking home, pulled inside. No warning, no reason, just taken. Murphy believed there was a right way to kill. Not quick, not distant, personal. He believed the blade was the ultimate weapon, and what happened to his victims was designed to send a message. By early 1976, multiple men had been killed this way, and the pattern was always the same: abduction, torture, silence. Belfast began to change. People stopped walking alone at night. Taxi drivers refused fares. Streets emptied earlier. Doors locked sooner. Because this wasn't a bomb you could avoid, or a gunman you could outrun. This was random, and that made it worse. None of the victims had any connection to the IRA. They weren't soldiers, they weren't fighters, they were civilians, chosen simply because of who they were. And for some families, there was a belief that the truth was never fully investigated. But Murphy's violence didn't stop there, because even within Loyalist groups there were lines, and Murphy crossed them. In late 1975, a Loyalist named Noel Shaw became a target. He wasn't a Republican, he wasn't the enemy, he was one of their own. Days earlier, a member of Murphy's gang had been killed, and Murphy wanted revenge. Shaw was captured, restrained, beaten, interrogated, and then executed. His body dumped in a back street. A message, not just to enemies, but to anyone who challenged Murphy. By now, even the UVF leadership was aware something was wrong. A new leadership had taken control, more controlled, more strategic. But Murphy didn't answer to them. He ignored orders, operated on his own terms, used his own methods. And no one stopped him. Not because they didn't know, but because they were afraid. Even senior figures later admitted they didn't have the nerve to take him on. In January 1976, Murphy struck again. A man walking along Cliftonville Road late at night. Murphy stepped out of a taxi, walked directly toward him, and opened fire. Close range, no hesitation, no warning. Just another killing. By this point, Murphy wasn't just another paramilitary. He was known across the Shankill. Feared, talked about, avoided. Some believed his actions were bringing shame to the community, but no one spoke out because everyone knew what would happen if they did. And the violence wasn't slowing down, it was escalating, becoming more organized, more deliberate, more terrifying. Because Murphy wasn't just killing anymore, he was building something. A system, a routine, a machine of violence that would soon reach its peak. By now, this wasn't just a gang. This wasn't just violence. This was something else entirely. because across parts of Belfast, one name was starting to dominate everything: Murphy. In areas around the Shankill, people began to change how they lived. Nights became quieter, streets emptied faster. People checked who was around them before turning corners, before answering questions, before even speaking. Because now it wasn't just about being in the wrong place, it was about being chosen. The butchers had developed a system. It was organised, repeated, predictable to them, but completely unpredictable to everyone else. A vehicle would move through the streets at night, watching, waiting, looking for someone alone. And once you were inside that vehicle, there was no way out. At the centre of it all was Murphy. He wasn't just participating anymore, he was directing it, deciding who lived and who didn't. Those around him followed orders, not just out of loyalty, but out of fear, because Murphy didn't just control victims, he controlled his own men. Even within the Loyalist community, something had shifted. People knew what was happening. They heard the rumours, the stories, the whispers. But no one spoke out, because speaking out meant becoming the next target. And this is where Murphy became different. Most violence during this time had a purpose: retaliation, strategy, control. But Murphy's violence didn't follow those rules. It went beyond politics, beyond ideology, into something far darker. And as the killings continued, Murphy began to believe something: that he couldn't be stopped. He'd already walked free once, avoided conviction, built a reputation that protected him. Even those who knew what he was doing stayed silent, and silence gave him power. That was the most terrifying part. There was no pattern you could follow, no way to predict it, no way to avoid it. You just needed to be there at the wrong time, in the wrong place. By early 1976, Belfast wasn't just living with violence anymore. It was living with a different kind of fear, one that crept through the streets, into homes, into entire communities, because this wasn't war as people understood it. This was something far more unpredictable, more personal, more brutal. And at the centre of it all was one man who thought he was untouchable. In March 1976, Murphy made a mistake. On the Cliftonville Road, he shot and seriously injured a young Catholic woman. This time there were witnesses. This time there was pressure. And the next day, Murphy was arrested. He was charged with attempted murder, but Murphy had already learned something important: how to work the system. Through a plea deal, the charge was reduced. Not attempted murder, just a firearms offence. And in 1977, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. For everything he had done, that was all. But prison didn't stop Murphy. In some ways, it made him more dangerous, because even behind bars, he still had influence. And according to investigators, Murphy gave an order: keep going, continue the killings, continue the pattern, continue the fear. And outside the gang obeyed. Under new leadership, the murders continued. Even without him, his system was still working. For months, police struggled to stop it. Resources were stretched, the city was overwhelmed. And then, something changed everything. One victim survived. Gerard McLaverty. He had been taken, attacked, left for dead. But he lived. Days later, police were driving him through the Shankill Road, and suddenly, he saw them. Two of the men responsible walking in the street like nothing had happened. He pointed them out, right there, in broad daylight. That moment broke everything apart. Arrests followed, interrogations, confessions. One by one, the gang collapsed. By 1979, they were sentenced to some of the longest terms in UK legal. And at the centre of it all, one name kept coming up: Murphy. He was questioned again, accused again, named as the leader, but the statements were withdrawn, retracted, and once again Murphy avoided conviction for the murders. In July 1982, Murphy walked free, back onto the Shankill Road, back onto the same streets where his name still carried fear. But things had changed. His marriage was over, the city had moved on, and Murphy hadn't. Within days of his release, the violence started again. A man was beaten to death, another was shot over a dispute about money. Murphy began extorting local businesses, even those who had once supported him, and that created a new problem, because now he wasn't just targeting enemies, he was interfering with other loyalist groups. Their money, their territory, their control. By this point, Murphy wasn't just feared, he was becoming a liability, even among his own side. His methods were too extreme, too unpredictable, too visible, and bringing too much attention. In October 1982, Murphy abducted another man, took him to his own house, and carried out another brutal killing. The aftermath was so severe, it shocked even those used to violence. And this time, it crossed the line. Just weeks later, November 16th, 1982, Murphy pulled up outside his girlfriend's house. A quiet moment, ordinary. And then, a van stopped nearby. Two men stepped out, armed, ready. They opened fire, dozens of rounds, no hesitation, no escape. Murphy was killed instantly. The IRA claimed responsibility, but that wasn't the full story, because according to intelligence reports, they didn't act alone. Information had been leaked, details about Murphy's movements, his habits, his location, and that information may have come from within Loyalism itself, from people who saw Murphy not as an asset, but as a problem. Murphy was buried with full paramilitary honours, masked men, uniforms, gun salutes, treated like a soldier. But not everyone saw it that way. Some called him something else entirely, not a hero, but a killer who brought fear to his own community. In the end, Murphy wasn't stopped by the police, not by the courts, not by the system, but by the same violence he had lived by and helped create. Lenny Murphy wasn't just a product of the Troubles. He was something darker, something even the conflict itself couldn't contain. And he wasn't the only one. Subscribe for more real stories behind the Troubles.